This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
4 minutes after 10 is the time. It's a strange exchange. In fact, if you combine that interview Nick did with David Cameron with some of the salient points from it and from the broader context in Jenny's news bulletin there are some confusing elements this morning about the state of play, aren't they? The idea that the Israeli government spokesman, I don't know how helpful it is to say, what if they were nuclear bombs? I mean, you know, if what was that? What if my auntie had wheels or something like that? I always remember that Italian chef saying it on the telly, and Gino De Campo said it on the telly, and it prompted epic corpsing in the studio. If ifs and buts were pots and pans, there'd be no need of tinkers, was a figure of speech when I was growing up. At which point, I suppose I should say, well, I don't even know if you can say tinkers anymore. And also the idea, as he said, that of course Israel has to respond. How ridiculous it is to suggest that Israel shouldn't respond to this. While in the same breath, we have the British Foreign Secretary saying that Iran's response to the bombing of the consulate in Damascus was not a response to the bombing of the consulate in Damascus, or at least not a proportionate response. I also, and listen, I know it's almost impossible to have a conversation about this issue without getting controversial. I don't want to. So I'm just checking whether you agree with me. I often hear about the scenarios like this, and I don't know whether it's right or wrong to wonder how many people got hurt first. I always wonder that first. So, because Iran claim a great success in its attacks upon Israel, and nobody got hurt. I wish all great successes. I wish all great military successes. I'd tell a lie. Nobody got killed as things stand. There are injuries, of course, including a young Bedouin girl who is still in a critical condition. But if Iran claims it was a great success and nobody died, I don't know how naive it makes me sound to suggest that those are the successes that I kind of like, in a way. And I'm downplaying how terrifying it would be, or any of the other elements. But goodness me, I think we can all thank whatever God you believe in, that as things stand, as far as I am aware, nobody got killed despite this unprecedented launch of missile and drone assaults upon Israel's territory. And Iran also say that that's it now. We've done enough. I read at the weekend, and listen, I'm sure you don't need me to remind you that I wade my way through this sort of thing with just as much confusion as you have. I guess the only difference between me and some people listening to this program is that I don't feel an automatic affinity with any element, any constituent of the conflict. Historically, I would have lent towards the necessity of Israel protecting itself, certainly against the Ayatollahs and the very, very oppressive religious regime in Iran. But you can't really, when you're looking at death tolls, you can't really be splitting those hairs anymore. So I wade through this just as confused as you would. And one of the most interesting things I read at the weekend was the idea that what Iran has done is essentially for the domestic audience. I had to read that twice. I had to dig a little deeper into it. So the attack upon the consulate in Damascus will, of course, be widely reported in Iran, even under perhaps especially under the full, almost totalitarian control of media that is exercised by the Supreme Guard. But it meant that the Iranian regime had to do something. It had to respond. And it's bizarre because you've got the British Foreign Secretary and the Israeli government spokesman saying they shouldn't have done, or that the attack upon the consulate didn't justify a response. But you've got a sort of almost a logical understanding that they had to do something. So they've done too much. They've launched too many bombs. They've launched too many missiles. But they haven't killed anyone. Do you see why I'm confused? Maybe you don't think I should be, in which case you know what to do. 0345 60 60 973 is the number that you need. And then you read about the celebrations in Iran The Telegraph have got a good stringer on the ground, I have to say. I'm very, very quick to criticise right-wing media, but the Telegraph's foreign desk have played a blinder this morning, as far as I can tell, and they draw a wonderful, or rather, a illustrative contradiction between the crowds on state television chanting "Death to Israel." And remember, if you're reading this or hearing this in Israel, that's a chilling sight. But their journalist on the ground actually speaking to people, if you like, real people who aren't approved of by the official regime, by state television, and they say things that will stop you in your tracks. So there are lengthy queues stretching for hundreds of meters outside petrol stations because people are trying to get out of Tehran. The airport's not due to open until this morning, so road was the only route out of town. There's a central city of Qom, which is very near an underground uranium enrichment facility, where residents have told the Telegraph that they are terrified. I called my cousins at midnight in the nearby village and told them to leave immediately. We might consider leaving Qom as well. The attack is one concern, but the potential nuclear radiation is another matter entirely. This is because the enrichment facility might be a target if Israel does respond militarily by attacking Iranian soil. People are frightened, and we're constantly talking with our relatives over the phone, discussing our options. So that's a civilian in Iran. Here's a farmer in Israel. I've been stockpiling canned food in anticipation of potential retaliation for years now, but I never imagined they would be stupid enough to do it. He's talking about the Iranian attack. We don't know what to do now and where to go. Israel will not just sit and watch. War is just a few steps away from us. And that is why I found Cameron's words this morning so unhelpful. Because I completely accept that position, or rather, I completely understand that statement there from a farmer, not from a politician. Israel will not just sit and watch. We're back to October the 7th. I'm afraid I don't have much truck with anybody who argued then that Israel should just sit and watch, that Israel should not respond, just as I don't have much truck anymore with people who claim that their response has been proportionate or fair or justified, the scale of it. And yet it seems to me that the message to Iran, whose regime is despicable by any objective measure, any moral measure, but the message to them is that they should just sit and watch. And that seemed to me to be what David Cameron said during his interview with Nick Ferrari earlier today, which is worth recapping on, actually.
I will come back one last time to that question, though. If Israel was responsible for the bombing in Damascus, are you critical of that?
Well, it's a matter for Israel. We haven't made a comment on it. The only thing I'd say is,
why not comment, Lord Cameron?
Well, I'll tell you why. Because if you look at what the Iranian Revolutionary Guard has done, they are the people that have been backing Hamas, who carried out the horrific October the 7th attack. They are the people who've been backing the Houthis, bombing ships in the Red Sea, irrespective of what country they come from. They are the people that back Hezbollah, launching missiles into Israel and causing, remember, there are about 100,000 people in the north of Israel who can't go to their homes because of Hezbollah. So can I understand Israel's frustration with the IRGC? Yes, I absolutely can. Do I think Iran's response with this state-on-state attack was justified? No, it wasn't. Unfortunately, it was an almost total failure.
But it wasn't justified to bomb an embassy in Damascus, was it?
As I say, I'm not getting into what Israel has or hasn't done.
Why not? That's the question I want to start with. I've shared my confusion for two reasons. Number one, I think you probably share it, and number two, it's my honest response to where we are now. And that bit there, why won't the British Foreign Secretary say yes or no, answer yes or no to the question of whether or not it's because everything now, or rather the latest chapter in this grisly saga begins with that attack. There is no earthly way that Iran would have launched missiles and drones against Israel if Israel had not attacked the Iranian consulate in Damascus and killed members of the Revolutionary Guard, killed senior military members of the Revolutionary Guard. The message they're sending to Israel is you can't keep killing our people. And yet, that phrase from the farmer in Israel will not just sit and watch, has a sort of ineluctable logic to it. And yet I can't help thinking the more we talk about this, the whole conversation seems to boil down to you think the other side should just sit and watch because if you don't like them, and you think your side should be retaliating and responding if you do. It's the most almighty double standard. At which point the British Foreign Secretary should, in my humble opinion, wade into the conversation and make some clear and salient observations, to which, should Israel have attacked the consulate in Damascus, seems to me to be the most obvious entry point. So I would like this morning to begin with your answers to the question. And remember, I want this from supporters. I don't know about supporters of Netanyahu. I think they're pretty thin on the ground now, but supporters of Israel, people who sympathise with this farmer here talking about stockpiling canned food in anticipation of potential retaliation. Why can't the British Foreign Secretary answer the question? You don't even have to want him to give the answer that you want. You just have to tell me, why can't he answer? What's the point of having international diplomacy if our most senior international diplomat can't answer a question about the rightness or wrongness, the wisdom or foolishness of an act by Israel that under every single reading, whether you're the president of the Benjamin Netanyahu fan club or whether you are the polar opposite of that, whatever that might be, you recognise that the attack on the consulate in Damascus, it's why we were talking about it on Friday. Friday's show was fascinating because it's not where we started, but almost all of the conversation sort of bottlenecked down towards that consulate in Damascus and that perception of double standards or whatever you want to call it. But you don't need to have skin in the game to answer this question. Why can't the British Foreign Secretary simply provide an answer to the question of whether or not Israel was right to attack the consulate in Damascus? Because if they hadn't, then we wouldn't today be talking about an unprecedented military assault upon Israel by Iran, albeit one in which so far, and the status of this little Bedouin girl is critical. She could yet die of her injuries, but thank goodness so far nobody died. 0345 6060973 is the number you need. Why can't the British Foreign Secretary, why won't the British Foreign Secretary answer that question? And the question couldn't be simpler. Should Israel have attacked the Israel and killed, remember, killed senior members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in the consulate in Damascus? It's 10:16. Hit the numbers now. You will get through. That's our starter at 10 this morning. That there will be other questions. This is an escalation that we probably reached the conclusion on Friday that this was going to happen. But I don't know if we thought it was going to happen quite so quickly. I don't know if we thought the attack would be quite so large scale, and albeit, and also feel free to tell me. The other thing I'll take this in the first instance is whether or not it's right or wrong of me to think that the death toll is among the most important, if not the single most important statistic here. I keep reading about how many missiles have been fired, when surely in the context of this sort of conversation, that the number of dead, just as in Gaza, just as on October the 7th, the top headline figure was the number of people killed. But maybe I'm misreading. I must be getting that wrong, because I seem to be the only person in the media who thinks that that's the most important element of a conversation like this one. So we will have other conversations. I will ask you other questions, but I want to start with that because I was listening to Nick interview Cameron, and I couldn't quite believe my ears. It's 10:17.
James O'Brien on LBC.
20 minutes after 10 is the time, and before we hit the phones, a very quick word on the stepping down from the BBC of a journalist I had the pleasure to work with, because I speak of Mark Urban, the diplomatic editor on Newsnight. Journalists, the first rule of journalism is never to become the story, although I think Twitter has probably broken that rule over the last few years, but Mark proves an exception to that rule once again this weekend by becoming the story. His retirement widely covered, not retirement, his decision not to reapply for a job as Newsnight is scaled down. Widely covered in all of the national news today. And I can tell you now that I've never worked with anybody who would be higher on the list of people you call at a time like this. So whatever the question is that you've got about this situation in the Middle East. Mark Urban, the outgoing diplomatic editor of Newsnight, after 35 years at the corporation, another huge talent that they can ill afford to lose, being allowed to walk away, he would be extraordinary. And that I mention that because I can come on the radio at LBC at 10 o'clock in the morning and express my confusion, and on a good day get contributions from people who really do know what they're talking about. The BBC needs people on the staff who know what they're talking about, and they need people on the staff who are better at talking about it and understanding it than anybody else in the world. And there's a very real danger. It occurred to me this morning when I looked at the two headlines side by side, one about Mark quitting and the other, of course, about the calls upon Benjamin Netanyahu not to escalate this situation still further. And I thought, oh dear, there's a BBC now that is going to be less equipped to deal with a story like this in 6 months' time or in 12 months' time. And very, very briefly, the moment I knew that he was special was I was sitting in an office at the BBC putting together the final running order for a programme that was due to go live in under an hour. And he poked his head around the door and said, "I'm terribly sorry to interrupt with the sort of production team. I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but I think a coup has just started in Turkey. It hasn't been reported here yet, but my sources on the ground are pretty clear that there's a coup attempt underway in Turkey." Reasons to interrupt a conversation. that's got to be up there. Anyway, enough. On with the phoning. Why won't the British Foreign Secretary pass comment on the attack upon the Iranian consulate in Damascus that pretty much everybody recognises as the trigger for the Iranian attack upon Israel? Kaz is in St Albans. Kaz, what would you like to say?
Morning, matey. You're right.
Very well, thanks. What's on your mind?
Good. Yeah. So, what Israel did by attacking the consulate is very dangerous. It sets a new level. As far as Cameron saying that he won't comment on it, or that the Iranians are backing the Houthis as proxies and so forth. I mean, on that basis, does that give Iran or Russia the excuse to bomb the UK consulate because we are
supporting their
enemies of what's going on there?
I mean, it's a pertinent question. It's not one I'm asking today. I want you to tell me why you think David Cameron simply couldn't answer or wouldn't answer Nick's question.
Oh, yeah, I think he values his job too much, doesn't he?
What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, he could probably lose it if he criticises Israel in any way.
And yet the calls for no retaliation open the door towards the necessity of criticism if a retaliation unfolds. We've heard Chuck Schumer use the word pariah to describe Israel. I mean, the claim that you can't say boo to an Israeli goose if you're a senior Western politician doesn't really seem to hold as much water as it used to do.
Yes. Exactly.
So, well, hang on. I'm challenging you, not agreeing with you. I think you probably could criticise. Look, in an ideal world, Israel wouldn't have done what they did, but I understand why they did, and it in no way justifies Iran's response. There you go. There's a politician. Why couldn't he say that?
So it doesn't justify Iran's... Well, yeah, he should have said that. But, I mean, look, Iran is saying that it's been a success on the basis that they've actually managed to hit the military base, haven't they, where the Israelis had their F-35.
Well, they say that, they claim that, and that counts for them as a result. At which point you would think that was not a cause for relief on all fronts. Israel don't need to go for blood for blood. They don't need to pursue that level of response. Iran apparently are content with this, 2 dead members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard notwithstanding, calling it quits. I don't like these phrases because they sound trivial, don't they? I use it, take the win. It's a dreadful phrase. I think Biden used it as well, not just Cameron. But why? Maybe that's part of the answer. I'll read you this from Mike because it really caught my eye. The Iranian retaliation was an act of diplomacy. Iran is a sophisticated country whose military leadership will have a very accurate understanding of how many missiles would have got through. I presume you mean militarily sophisticated because they're not sophisticated in many other ways, certainly not morally sophisticated, Mike. The fact that only a handful of munitions reached the ground suggests an outstanding calibration of their response combined with careful communication of their intentions. Total failure would have been a disastrous own goal, and excessive damage to Israeli cities would have have been a catastrophic escalation. Iran has honour intact and has confirmed the accuracy of their assessment of Israeli defences. As regards the justification of their retaliation, is an embassy not considered sovereign soil of the country that occupies it, which is why you wonder why Cameron couldn't say more. But I want to balance out Mike's comment with this from Peter. You don't have to make it personal, Peter, but hey-ho. Don't be so naive, James. Iran has been chanting death to Israel for years. This was inevitable regardless of what Israel was alleged to have done. I mean, I think you're the only person I've met so far who thinks that the attack upon Israel over the weekend had absolutely nothing to do with the attack upon the consulate in Damascus. It doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means you're lonely. John's in Camden. John, what would you like to say?
Well, hi, James.
Hello,
I
John.
want to say that your question is very pertinent. Why the Britain and US always support Israel? It's because it's support.
Well, listen, John, that wasn't actually my question. Albeit you could see it. You could see it as no, I know you could see it as the latest iteration of that question, but that wasn't actually my question because Biden in particular has been calling upon Netanyahu to wind his neck in for some time now in a way that I can't really remember seeing in the last 2 or 3 presidencies.
Yeah, but that's just talk. They're still selling them the weapons. Look,
right. But we're talking about talk. Don't talk over me when I'm talking over you. It makes a complete makes a mess of everything. Just focus if you can on the question that I'm asking. Okay. Why can't Cameron answer the question at all? Because he could have answered it by saying, no, yes, Israel was entirely justified in it, but he wouldn't answer it at all.
Because you don't understand. Since Britain defeated the Ottoman Empire in 1917, the European powers and then the US has ruled the Middle East. Middle Eastern people are fed up. There's 38 military bases in the Middle East.
I think you might. I can wait for a bit. I can wait for a bit for you to come back to the question that I've actually asked. But we're in 1917 at the moment, which means, and it's 10:27. I've got the news.
It takes 1 minute. It just takes.
All
1
right.
minute.
So remember, the question is why can't Cameron either approve or condemn the attack upon the consulate in Damascus?
Because they liked that attack. They wanted that attack. They were.
So then he could approve it. Then he could say, yes, Israel was entirely justified.
Yeah, but governments don't always say their policies out loud.
So why won't he say it out loud? Why won't he say it out loud?
Because I'm trying to explain to you, it's British policy to divide and rule. Why don't you want to understand? You were asking this question also last week. Why does Britain not stop the arms sales? You know, the 7 workers were killed. They were killed by British drones and British missiles. But you will never see that on the BBC. And look at the BBC.
Well, it's not a question of never seeing it. Never seeing it on the BBC. What you've done, and I understand why, and I respect it up to a point. You've brought too much to this question. The specifics of why.
You can't be superficial. Look,
it's not a question of being superficial. David Cameron could have said. He could have said, and I think perhaps at a previous point in history, he would have said Israel is completely within its rights to have launched that attack upon the consulate. The Iranian
revolution. Why not? It's against international law and Vienna Convention. Look, the Iranians tried since the 1st of April. They went to the United Nations. They asked the resolution to condemn the Israeli attack. The US, Britain, and France opposed that, and they wouldn't even let that to be discussed in the United Nations. Iran didn't want to attack Israel. Look what happened when they killed General Soleimani.
No, you're doing it again. I do understand. I understand everything you've said already.
You said Iran is despicable. Iran is morally not correct. I'm Iranian. I'm offended. Why would you say that?
Well, the same reason you left.
No, it's not. I left during the Shah's time, so don't come to conclusions. I left in 1976 when the Shah was there.
I'll tell you why I said it. The women who get killed for not wearing their scarf properly.
Nobody gets killed. When did you go to Iran? I was in Iran.
All right, John. My instincts were correct, but I'm very grateful to you for listening. 10:30 is the time. You're an apologist for a vile regime, which is fine. But maybe get that up a little bit earlier in the call for all of our benefit. 10:30 is the time. Jenny Barsby is here now with your headline.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 33 minutes after 10. No hostages puts it well, and I don't think they'll mind me telling you that. I think I'm right in saying that a lot of their understanding of these issues it comes from watching similar situations unfold elsewhere in the world historically. War's madness defies reason. Israel attacked Iran's consulate to punish Iran's support for its enemies and deter future support, right? So you can nod along with that. Iran retaliated to punish Israel's attack and deter future Israeli attacks. You can probably nod along with that. But both nations gained nothing material. You can nod. Even Iran seems comfortable offsetting the death of 2 Revolutionary Guard generals against the happily, currently, 0 death toll of their attack over the weekend. They go on. Cameron won't criticise Israel, as most UK allies in the Middle East, like Oman and Saudi Arabia, also regularly break, quotes, the rules, end quotes. So condemning rule breakers is seen as risking leaving the UK without allies in the region. So Cameron reserves condemnations for enemies. And I don't know why, but the image of the journalist Khashoggi just popped up in my head. The gentleman that was butchered by Saudi secret police in the embassy in Turkey without any meaningful impact upon the Saudi regime's status on the world stage or indeed role in international business. So this idea of double standards, I understand why people find it offensive or hurtful, but you've got to look for clarity on these things. And that's what David Cameron elected not to provide today. Elected not to provide. It is 10:35. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Mark's in Richmond. Mark, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. Long time listener, first time caller.
Welcome. I'm glad you've chosen a nice, easy topic to break your duck.
Well, I wish I'd have called before the news, actually, because the WhatsApp message just read out. It's taken space to all the points I wanted to make. But I think, and I agree, it's his choice, which I think we can all see in terms of the argument of double standards, the argument of, well, they were justified, which may then contradict the position on the attack of a diplomatic station, because you can only really justify it if it's viewed as a viable threat from an Israeli perspective, and one can understand that. Everyone's nodding their heads there. But the problem, I think, the reason he avoided even making a comment was because that would internally provide conflict within the party, within the Tory party, in terms of the stance, and could lead open to some sort of attack, whether from the Jewish lobby or from the Palestinian side.
Jewish lobby is a very loaded term with quite anti-Semitic. I know you didn't mean it. Well, I presume, I hope you didn't mean it like that. But you mean,
I will retract it unreservedly.
Thank you, because you mean people lobbying on behalf of the Israeli government, which is a very different thing.
Absolutely. So sympathetic to Israel
this regime
and its people.
Yes,
exactly. So I think that's why he avoided making a clarification, which he could have done. I think he could have done, and if he'd have had the statements like language that should befit him of that position, then he could have made it. He could have made an argument for both sides, if you like, but without committing to either.
As opposed to doing neither. It might have been an even tougher trick, but I'm thinking, if I'm sitting here thinking that not only will Israel be justified in responding to this attack, but it must respond in a very robust fashion, how would I answer the question of why David Cameron didn't defend the attack upon the diplomatic buildings in Damascus?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
Nor do I, but the phone lines are open. Because there must be people... No, I mean it. There must be people listening who want to come at it from entirely the opposite angle, and I really want to hear their answers as well.
Absolutely.
So thank you, mate. And there it is, so you are someone who believes that Israel must respond. Perhaps you're still supportive of what's going on in Gaza. Why would David Cameron not defend the assault upon the diplomatic compound in Damascus? And to go back, I was talking very specifically. I couldn't remember her name at the time, but let me clarify that I was talking a moment ago about the killing of Mahsa Amini, arrested for wearing an inappropriate hijab and then murdered in custody. So I am fairly confident in some of my depictions of the Iranian regime, although. I've never been there. I rely upon people like Omid Jalili and others to tell me what is unfolding in their country of origin. Have I misheard? I'll read this text. I hope it's a joke. Did I mishear James O'Brien, or is there currently a coup unfolding in Turkey, says Celine? I can't find any mention of it on any news platforms or channels. No, I was telling a story, Celine, about the time when there was a coup underway in Turkey, but you can relax. There definitely isn't one. Even my luck isn't going to extend to there being a new coup attempt launched. Just as I say, there is currently no coup. There is no coup attempt underway in Turkey. 10:39 is the time. Kieran's in Dublin. Kieran, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Your last caller there touched on sort of what I was going to say. I think the reason he can't say it, he couldn't say anything, was because it'll be counter to what the UK government have been saying all along. They'd back Israel to the hilt, as the states are saying. And if he was to condone it, or he was to make any comment on it, well, then basically people will be looking at that and saying, well, the UK then are in support of bombing consulates. So he said nothing. Therefore, that can't be said. Well, that's basically what they're doing by him saying nothing. If he had said, him saying nothing is sticking with the party line, whereby we're backing Israel, we're backing Israel, we're backing Israel. If he said anything other than that, that they were within their rights to do that, well, then it would be a case of, well, then the UK are saying to Israel, basically, you give carte blanche to do whatever you want.
So forgive me, you're cautiously approving of the position that he's adopted then?
No, I'm definitely not.
Okay.
I mean, the question was why could he not say anything? That was the question.
Yes.
And the reason I believe he can't say anything, because if he does, it goes counter to what the British government are said. The British government have said that if he came out and said, Israel shouldn't have done that and they should have done this, that and the other, okay, he could have come out and said that. But if he came out and said then that Israel were quite entitled to do this because of, they're quite entitled, to respond to the attack, well, then it's going counter to what the UK government have said, where they'll back Israel.
Yeah, so not approving, but you're describing diplomacy.
Well, I don't even think it's diplomacy. I think the UK have signed themselves up to something now. It's like themselves in the States. They've basically given Netanyahu carte blanche to do what he wants there now. Do you know what I mean? It's like,
while simultaneously urging him not to.
Yeah, but they're not really. No, because they could come out and say, well, look, you keep going down this road. The war started on the other side of the country, and now we're looking at this side of the country where there's something else going on. This Iranian attack, there was, okay, that poor girl, yeah, hopefully she'll be okay. But that's it. Why now retaliate and make something, it's just gone back. It's like the war in Gaza. The war in Gaza was over ages ago, but he's still continuing it.
Right, it depends on it. I mean, it wasn't over if you prioritize, if the end game is the release of the hostages and the eradication of Hamas.
No, I appreciate that. But the blatant just going in and wiping everything out. I mean, I was looking at the sky there last night and looking at Jerusalem, Israel, and you've seen all the cranes building all the new buildings over there, and then you look over to the other side, and it's just decimation. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, so over in a kind of, in a sense beyond the professed
they
objectives
can't get
of the war.
All they're doing now is just wrecking the place.
I hope someone will have a go at telling me this from the other perspective as to why David Cameron, as a staunch ally of Israel, and would not come out and say that the attack upon the consulate in Damascus on April the 1st was justified. Of course, I think technically they haven't accepted responsibility for it. They haven't sort of publicly said, but the entire conversation is being conducted on the grounds that that's a given. And indeed, the conversation with Nick earlier was conducted entirely on those grounds. If that was Cameron's reason for not saying it, he could have said so. That bit there is going to be bad news, I would have thought, for a Netanyahu fan listening. I wonder what answer they would give as to why Cameron wouldn't come out in support of their side of the argument, if you like. But that, as I say, the phone line is open for that. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And Richard makes a point that quite a few people have made. Call me an old cynic, but hasn't the Damascus attack at this time done exactly what the Israeli government wanted? Because no one is now talking about the famine and death in Gaza. We did touch on this on Friday, Richard, the idea of two traps being set, one by Hamas and one by Netanyahu, and both have proved effective. So Hamas prompted a response from Israel, which is widely regarded as having seen a dilution in international support for their position, and calls up to and including Chuck Schumer, the most senior Jewish politician in America, for restraint, although largely unheeded, are also in some ways unprecedented. And then the response, I think that's why, to address Richard's point directly, I think that's why Iran is at such pains, or rather the Iranian government is at such pains, not only to describe its strike on Israel as a success yesterday, but also to insist that as far as it was concerned, the military operation was now over. That is them, if you'd allow me to run with this metaphor, that is them kind of just putting their fingers into the trap, putting their fingers into the lion's mouth, and then trying to whip them out just in time, and then doing a lap of honour for saying, yes, look what we've done. We can get I think this works quite well as a metaphor, actually. We can get our hand into the lion's mouth, but we've taken it straight back out again. And the proof of that, I think, lies in the comments that have come from the regime on the very, very specific insistence that as far as the Iranian regime is concerned, the military operation is now over because, according to them, they struck most of the military targets they had intended as a reprisal for that assault on Iran's consulate in Damascus at the beginning of the month, on the 1st of April. It's also worth reminding us that the operation had been telegraphed for days in advance, and this is the quote from one of the Iranian spokespeople. We see this operation as a result, and in our opinion, as over, and there is no intention to continue it. And if the Zionist regime takes action against us, either on our soil or in the centres belonging to us in Syria, or another country does, our next operation will be bigger. So, and if you were unhappy with me for being confused at 10 o'clock this morning, and I hope you weren't, we now arrive at a point 45 minutes later where both participants in this escalation could conceivably claim a win. David Cameron telling the Israelis to take the win this morning, while the Iranian regime is describing the success of its operation. And I say again, nobody, touch wood, nobody died. It's 10:46.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 10:49. The question this hour is about David Cameron's refusal to either condemn or condone the Israeli attack upon the Iranian consulate in Damascus, which I think is almost unanimous, with the exception of our correspondent here, Peter. It is unanimously accepted as a trigger point for the Iranian response this weekend, a response which was scuppered almost entirely by Israeli, American, British and French interventions, the drones and the missiles shot out of the sky, but in the sense that Iran has demonstrated. Well, I'll read you a slightly chilling text, actually, from Jonathan. The stupidity of the Israeli government attack on the Iranian consulate was to open the way for the Iranians to test their missile range. If you ask me, based on this reason, I would say that Iran was successful in testing their range. And as I said, the regime itself is insistent that A, it was a success, and B, that it's completely over. The chap I was quoting earlier, I lost his name in the melee, is the chief of the general staff, General Mohammed Bagheri, further claimed that an Israeli intelligence center close to the Syrian border and an airbase had been destroyed to a significant extent, quotes, and put out of operation. In the next hour, we're going to ask what would be gained from an Israeli escalation if Netanyahu and his three-man war cabinet decide to respond to this attack. I mean, A, the question would be, what does it look like? But B, what would be gained? What would the win be? As David Cameron, in slightly unhelpful language, urges them to take the win, i.e. to just leave it now, which Iran appear to be happy to do in the short term. What would be gained by carrying on? 10:51 is the time. And before we go to James in Britain, who's been waiting for ages, and I'll be with you imminently. Actually, no, I'll go to James first, and then I'll make the point that Nadeem is rightly keen for me to make. James, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello,
Well, I actually think that there's a really simple answer to, almost like a mystery hour answer to this one. Ultimately, Cameron, as Foreign Secretary and an ally, one of the staunchest allies of Israel, he can't refer to the attack on in Syria and Damascus as happening, so long as the Israeli government are neither accepting nor denying. You know, I think it's pure diplomacy.
But he could have said that.
Well, could he really though? I mean, this is, you actually made pretty well my point while I was waiting to come on the line. But I think I don't even know. Well, what could he say in that case?
I mean, I think he could say what you just said. He said, you can't ask me to comment on actions of Israel that Israel hasn't taken responsibility for yet. But maybe that would cause a diplomatic incident. Taken responsibility for yet. You see, I think as soon as you make any, that's all right. I won't say yet. Then I won't say yet. I'll just say Israel hasn't taken responsibility. But I mean, in a way, I like this analysis because it nudges us towards the possibility that Cameron offered up the best of all available suboptimal answers.
Yeah.
Which is what diplomacy is. That's what diplomacy is, really, in some senses, in some ways.
Yeah, which is why I think it's a lot simpler than much of the analysis. The analysis over the past hour has been fascinating. But I do think that
it could be as simple as that. Good job you didn't get on first, then, isn't it?
Yes, I actually had that thought. I thought this is a question or answer, James.
No, exactly. Well, you're not getting a round of applause, James. That would obviously be that would be wholly inappropriate. But I do take your point. I don't agree. But then, of course, I would say that, wouldn't I? And the reason why I don't agree is because that there is no question really in the minds of any commentators about the relationship. But yeah, you could be right. Diplomatically speaking, the absence of an admission or an acceptance, perhaps is a better word, of responsibility creates a diplomatic grey area in which David Cameron is not only able but quite possibly compelled not to answer the question that Nick asked. To which I would respond by saying, well, then he could have said that. He could have said that himself. It is 10:54. Nadim's been in touch. He says, "Dear James, if you have time, could you mention that the security guard," and he's referring now to the mass murder in Sydney at the weekend at the Westfield Shopping Centre, could you mention that the security guard who died in the stabbings was a Pakistani refugee? Apparently he died trying to stop the attacker. I haven't seen that second bit of the story yet, but it seems feasible. He was the only man killed. People seem to have forgotten him. Hopefully it's not because he was a Muslim. I'm glad you've reminded me of that, Nadim. I was going to say it. I was going to talk about it and indeed him because, well, not least because there was that probably inevitable. Well, actually, it was a little bit unpleasant, wasn't it? Because when a killing like that unfolds and the news first breaks, you 5 years ago would expect people like Little Tommy Ten Names and other Islamophobes, you would have expected them to be unable to disguise their glee at the possibility that it would be some sort of Islamist terror attack, to the point where they would say that it was even before the evidence emerged, which is just silly, because you only usually have to wait a few hours. And there has never been, I don't think, a recorded case of an attack that the security services believed to have been terror-inspired being covered up or lied about. It simply doesn't happen in the way that some people like to think it does. So all you have to do is sit tight and wait to see. If another school shooting in America happened this week, you would not have people queuing up on social media to insist that lonely white Christian boys should all be deported, or that this is evidence that there's a deep and systemic problem with lonely white boys in the whole of the American continent. It just doesn't happen. But 5 years ago, you'd have expected it to come from the usual sources. This weekend, horribly, it came from people who really should know better. And the absence of thought, that there is no earthly reason to claim that it was something before it was proved. If it had been an Islamist terror attack, then you can make all of your points, whether they are fair or not, in the context of evidence having been provided. But there was no evidence. And then to make their shame more profound, as Nadeem reminds us, to make their shame even more profound, it emerged relatively quickly that one of the dead, indeed the only dead man, was a Pakistani refugee called Faraz Tahir, who was on his first shift at the shopping centre. So what broad generalisations can you extrapolate from that? What does that tell you about Muslim refugees in countries like Australia or countries like Britain? Because when you thought it was a terrorist, there were all sorts of lessons to be learned. There were all sorts of extrapolations and generalisations that these people could make. And now we find out not only that the murderer was not a Muslim or a refugee or any of those things, we find out that one of his victims was a refugee and a Muslim, a Pakistani refugee. So where are all the generalisations now? Where are all the claims that Faraz Tahir is representative of the Pakistani refugee experience in Australia? To clarify, I don't know for sure that he is a Muslim, but he's definitely a Pakistani refugee. So odds are he would be of that faith. Do you see what I mean? And that's why you should. That's why you should wait. I'm not going to mention any names. No, I probably I don't know whether or not it's helpful or unhelpful. But you don't need me. Not least because I wouldn't be able to name all of them. I'm just pointing out that it used to be confined to far right, attention-seeking Islamophobes, desperate for the murders to have been committed by a Muslim, because then they could make their far-reaching and sweeping claims. And when it turns out that the opposite is true, the only Pakistani refugee in the story is a victim. Tumbleweed. It's funny that, right? Hassan is in Forest Hill with the last call on the David Cameron question. What's it going to be, Hassan?
Hi, great
Hello,
speaking to you. I think it's easier to get through to an Ayatollah than it is to your good self.
We are victims of our own success, Hassan, but you're here now. There's not long, so use your time wisely.
Okay, so the thing about the weekend, what Iran did, someone had to put the mad dog of the Middle East, Netanyahu, under control. It had to be tamed. America can't do it, UK can't do it, France can't do it, none of the Arab countries can. So he needed to be put in place. He's conducted a genocide in Gaza.
Well, that's
no
not
one has done anything about
that's
it.
not for either of
now,
us. Hang on, Hassan. That's not. Words are important. That's not for us to decide. It is a decision that will be taken by the International Court in The Hague. You can use this language, of course, it's freedom of speech, but equally I have to remind you of the parameters of criminality and the fact that they're simply not defined by us. So, to be clear, would Iran have done this even without the attack upon the consulate in Damascus?
I think it would have.
Because then we've got two people who think this from opposite sides of the fence. You and Peter, who don't think the attack was the trigger.
I think it was in the pipeline, simply because so many children have been slaughtered, and no one is doing anything about it. America. I mean, look at David Cameron, not even condemning the attack to the Damascus. Iranian
not condoning it either. I mean, remember that Iran's big proxy in the area is Hezbollah rather than Hamas, although they are clearly supportive of Hamas. An act of war as part of the broader picture in Gaza. It's a contribution. I disagree with you, but I couldn't win an argument necessarily, or at least even if I could win it, it wouldn't prove I was right. So the idea that it is just part of the even broader picture as opposed to the narrow post-Damascus attack picture is one that we can add to the list. 1 minute after 11 is the time. Up next, we're staying with the broader question, focusing in on a different, narrower question, which will be what would be gained? I mean, what would happen? We asked on Friday. And that question has, I think it's fair to say, not been answered definitively. If this were Mystery Hour, there would be, at this point, no round of applause. What would actually happen? How many people, I wonder, were surprised by the scale, the nature, the sophistication of Iran's attack, albeit that it failed? not according to their assessment. So we've demonstrated the Iron Dome is a unique and extraordinary piece of ordnance, piece of military hardware, and it did an amazing job. But I think Iran demonstrated this weekend that it is not infallible, the Iron Dome. So what would Netanyahu gain from continuing? And Benny Gantz, the former defence minister, who I think sits in the war cabinet, has already said words that make an escalation sound inevitable. What would an escalation achieve? 2 minutes after 11 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 5 minutes after 11. United Nations chief warning this morning that the Middle East is on the brink. I don't think they're going to win any prizes for perspicacity for that contribution to the conversation. But I would quite like to play one more clip, actually. I tried to do... I don't know whether you've noticed. I stopped some time ago. They never talk to me. I still occasionally do, but I just don't think it's helpful. It sounds so childish. It is fair to say that if any members of government are booked by young producers to appear on this programme, then about 20 minutes before they appear, because the young producer don't know that this is going to happen, we'll get a call saying, "Oh, Tory, they're not available. They won't come." It even happened with Full Disclosure. We had Tom Tugendhat booked, I think, for Full Disclosure, and that mysteriously got cancelled. But it just makes me sound like a bit of a divot when I say, "Oh, they won't come on this show." They won't, but you don't need me. I mean, some politicians have very good reasons for doing what they do. Sadiq Khan, for example, very reluctant to appear on programmes presented by people who were four square behind Zach Goldsmith's very racist mayoral campaign. He's explained that many, many times. So I don't do that. And another thing I try not to do is say, "Oh, if only I could have had that interview, I'd have asked this question." But there was a question bubbling in the back of my mind for David Cameron, and it's just been brought to my attention that Kay Burley did actually ask it on Sky News. So I thought it was probably worth listening to.
A reckless and dangerous thing for Iran to have done. And I think the whole world can see all these countries that have somehow wondered, well, what is the true nature of Iran? It's there in black and white.
What would Britain do if a hostile nation flattened one of our consulates?
Well, we would take the very strong action.
And Iran would say that that's what they did?
Well, what they did, as I said, was a massive attack.
So they were right to respond, but they overreacted, is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that the attack they carried out was on a very large scale, much bigger than people accepted.
They have a right to respond?
Well, countries have a right to respond when they feel they've suffered an aggression. Of course they do. But look at the scale of that response. Had those weapons not been shot down,
respond, but they just overreacted.
There could have been thousands of casualties, including civilian casualties. I think that's a really important point to take into account.
That is really interesting, actually. I don't want to use the ifs and buts line again because it feels inappropriate, but my goodness me, that was a man on the spot, wasn't it? That line of questioning, I would have thought absolutely essential in the context of that conversation. 8 minutes after 11 is the time. So there seems to be a broad consensus that Israel will do something. Benny Gantz, the former defence minister who sits in Netanyahu's war cabinet, making it appear that perhaps it will be a long game, if you like, rather than a immediate response. But it's a new front, and it's a new nightmare in a sense for Israel, a new front. The Americans are warning, or the US is warning against taking the conflict to Iran. That's one of the headlines. In fact, the major headline of The Guardian, the front page headline, US warning as Israel weighs up response to Iran's attack. Washington saying it would not take part in any Israeli counteroffensive against Tehran. Two members of Israel's three-man war cabinet making statements suggesting they were taking a longer-term view of the response to Iran's first ever direct attack on Israeli soil. It's a moment to reflect upon the gravity of that, I think, particularly for people in Israel. First ever attack upon Israeli soil. So you derive enormous comfort from the fact that almost all of the 300 missiles and drones were intercepted before they could land in Israel. But it gives you an idea of Iran's capabilities. More than 100 ballistic missiles. And of course, as Cameron said, although I think even the people firing them knew that the interceptions were almost guaranteed, that almost is scary. That almost is pertinent. But the mood clearly is that the Israeli government will respond. Israel will build a regional coalition, said Benny Gantz, and exact the price from Iran in the fashion and timing that is right for us. So, drawing encouragement from Friday's programme, when the relatively flabby question of what would happen if did actually prompt some really interesting contributions, some really exceptional. We're very lucky now, actually, and that doesn't happen overnight. I don't think if this was my first shift at LBC, I'd come on air and say, what would happen if Iran attacked Israel, as I did on Friday, or indeed, what would happen, or what might Israel's retaliation look like, as I'm about to ask you. It's about trust, I think. It's about mutual trust, and I'm going to trust you with these questions. The first is, what would be achieved? What would be achieved? What would Israel or Netanyahu achieve by attacking Iran, I suppose we'd have to say, or retaliating against Iran? I don't know what an attack would look like. I suppose they could attack another consulate somewhere else, but I don't know how likely that is, really. So what would be achieved? And you can be cynical or not on that. You can be as clear-eyed as you want. You can be a little bit cynical but as long as you're honest. What would be achieved? So David Cameron is urging Israel to take the win, and the win is they threw an awful lot at you, and this poor Bedouin girl in hospital notwithstanding, they threw an awful lot at you, but they didn't really hurt you. I don't know what you want to compare that to. Compare that to what the Palestinian people in Gaza are going through. It looks like a win, right? Who would you rather be? A Palestinian in Gaza dealing with the attack of Israel, or an Israeli in Israel dealing with the attack of Iran? Take the win, says David Cameron, in infelicitous language, but I don't think necessarily it's language that deserves to be condemned. The mood in Israel, the mood in the Israeli government, certainly in the three-man war cabinet, seems to be, no, we will not take the win. We will fight back. We will respond. We will retaliate. What win lies therein? What win lies in? What win lies in not taking the win? Sounds like a bloody tongue twister. But do you see what I mean? What is the gain? What is the advantage? Is it military? Is it logistic? Is it rhetorical? Is it political? What is the advantage? Is it entirely selfish, as much of this has increasingly appeared to be about Netanyahu staying out of court, staying in power and out of court, possibly even, under some readings of his situation, out of jail? Would you really risk a war with Iran? Would one man really tolerate or contemplate the possibility of an all-out war with Iran simply to protect his own political and personal position back at home in Israel? I don't know. So I'm asking you. So what's the win for Netanyahu if he chooses to ignore US warnings, if he chooses to ignore David Cameron, if he chooses to ignore the United Nations, and he decides to respond, to retaliate, to avenge himself upon Iran? What would the win be? 0345 6060 973. What advantage would be gained by that decision? Okay. And then we move into the realms of speculation, but I think we can do it responsibly. What might it look like? So when they talk about adopting a more long-term than short-term approach, but they also talk about assembling a coalition, a regional coalition, and exacting the price from Iran in the fashion and timing that is right for us. So how do you, and I hope this doesn't sound, I don't know that I'd be asking this question if there had been a death toll from events of this weekend, but how do you avenge an attack that killed nobody? So what might Israel's response look like? So there's two questions about the same thing. The first is, what does it achieve? And the second is, what might it look like? What will it look like? And you can answer either or both of those, but I'm not giving you the opportunity to answer neither. Okay, so 11:14 is the time, and I take any answer that you've got on this, but I do just because it is a need for a little bit of light relief. Steve Howell has been listening to the same program that you have, the one where I described Iran as a murderous regime devoid of morality. I cut one caller off a little quicker than perhaps some of you might have liked for appearing to be an apologist for the Ayatollahs, absolutely unequivocal in my condemnation of what that regime represents, what the Iranian Revolutionary Guard does, citing, of course, the murder of Mahsa Amini, whose offence before being killed in captivity was simply to have worn her hijab in an inappropriate fashion. The coverage that we've provided on this programme, thanks in part to Iranian exiles and their children, such as Omid Jalili. It's all there. It's all on the record. Steve Howell's listened to all of that, and he's texted to say, your pro-Iran tone is a sad disgrace to British broadcasting. So even on a delicate and serious matter such as this one, there are still people desperate to get a ticket into Idiot's Corner. And for you, Steve, today, your dreams come true.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 18 minutes after 11, and it's a double-edged question. Part one, what would they gain? What would Israel gain now from retaliating to the Iranian offensive, the unprecedented Iranian offensive of this weekend, which everyone's claiming, everyone is describing it as being exactly what they wanted it to be. So David Cameron describing it as an enormous failure, while the Iranian regime describe it as an enormous success. The only thing that we can all agree on is that Iran says it's over. Iran says that's it now. So if it's a sort of face-saving exercise for domestic political reasons, then they have, if you like, flexed their muscles in front of their own population, and the world can be thankful, and possibly it was close to deliberate, that nobody got killed. Nobody got killed, which leads me to my second question. How do you retaliate? 1,200 people murdered on October the 7th. The idea that could be responded to without blood being spilt would have been naive to the nth degree. But how do you respond to an attack in which no one was killed? In a fashion and timing that is right for us, to quote Benny Gantz, a member of that wartime unity government. Sam's in Bristol to kick this off. Sam, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. It's lovely to speak to you. It's been a little while.
Likewise.
I started off talking to the reporter on the phone about how at first I thought that this was a power grab from somebody who's running out of road. And then when running out of road was put back to me as well, when you say, is this road the support from his allies, from the support from the international community, which is obviously dwindling, it made me think of, obviously Netanyahu is going after the almost entirety of what we call Palestine now, of Gaza. And a lot of people around the world think he's not just going for the terrorists anymore. I think that's a fairly valid claim as well, with all the civilian deaths. Iran is almost like a commonly recognized evil, and whilst I'm not sure if his intentions right now is to go into a full-scale war with them, I feel like, rather cynically maybe, it's almost sort of like, well, maybe if I throw my eggs into this basket, I'll get more international support because of, sort of how well documented.
So they might not. I might not be able to rely upon the support for the continuing conflict in Gaza. But my goodness me, they're not going to. I mean, I think Biden's already used the phrase "ironclad," hasn't he? Although, I accept that they are urging him not to do it. So it's a small fly. It's a mosquito in the ointment of your analysis.
I can't help but think. And this is obviously my opinion now, I can't help but think that if it were not for diplomatic difficulties, and if it were not for the sort of maybe being scared of the bigger picture, I think sort of not NATO, that's such a silly thing to say, but Western influences would have been more gung-ho on trying to dismantle Iran already over the years. I kind of feel like they are a bit of a problematic state, and I can't help but think that maybe if a country like Israel then, ends up going into war with them, does that then give allies a bit more of a scope to start, being on the offensive in Iran as well? I'm not sure. I don't know if I'm being maybe too cynical now, but I can't help but think that
you're flirting.
Iran is a problem that needs to be addressed.
You're flirting with regime change, aren't you?
Yeah, well, I think it needs to happen at some point. I think it absolutely, for the people of Iran more than anyone else.
And there was a sense last year, certainly, that it was edging closer than it had ever edged before. But those voices those hopes seem to have been dashed. Well, I mean, crikey! I mean, you've kicked us off in a pretty spectacular fashion. The idea that Netanyahu would actually end up with a broad coalition of international support if he did go in hard against Iran. But that, of course, brings us back to the philosophical challenge of trying to justify a retaliation for an attack that killed nobody.
I know. I can't help but think that Iran is almost the pariah state already, and Israel obviously has been described as moving in that direction. Is it kind of, well, I look like the bad guy right now, who's an even badder guy that I can go after and garner some support? To narrow it, and Raymond makes this point, actually, thank you, Sam. Raymond makes this point rather well. Please understand that Israel is facing an existential threat from Iran and its proxies, i.e. Hamas, Hezbollah. I do understand that, Raymond. I make the point often and repeatedly. They are therefore obliged to ensure Iran can never develop nuclear weapons, as Iran has shown this weekend that it wants to destroy Israel. So the retaliation has to be to destroy their nuclear facilities ASAP. This is what I mean about you can have two contributions that are completely at odds with each other and yet are equally valid and plausible. I don't know that. I don't know, Raymond, and perhaps you could clarify if you wanted to, how you could argue that Iran has shown this weekend that it wants to destroy Israel without simultaneously having to argue that Israel has shown since October that it wants to destroy Gaza. And, you know, if you were to judge that by any objective measure, Israel's attempts to destroy the whole of Gaza have been a lot more successful than Iran's attempts to destroy Israel. So if you take a genuine moral human equivalence, I think you'd end up in a pretty sticky situation, Raymond, with that, but not with the first bit of it, the existential threat allied with the nuclear capability. 11:24 is the time, which is why those words from the Iranian civilians in the vicinity of a uranium enrichment plant in Iran were so poignant. They're just legging it. They're just getting in the first train out of Dodge. Those sort of stories, those sort of people sometimes get missed out of the broader coverage, don't they? Let's go to Hassan, who's in Leeds. Hassan, what would you like to say?
Hi there. Good morning, James.
Hello, mate.
Hope you're well.
Very well.
Yeah. So one thing to keep stock of, first thing is that Israel, under Netanyahu anyway, is not going to be able to do anything without the green light of the United States. So I'll give you a past example and president.
Go on then, and then I'll tell you why I'm making funny noises.
Okay, past example.
Yeah.
1982, one phone call from Ronald Reagan to Menachem Begin to stop the war in Lebanon. They had to stop it. 2015, Netanyahu goes to Congress, trying to rally support against the nuclear deal with Iran. And despite that, still trying to undermine President Obama's legitimacy, still went ahead and still signed the nuclear deal with Iran, despite Trump obviously scuppering it. And then following that as well, and most pertinently to recently, have Israel actually gone into Rafah yet? Because that's the red line currently for the Western International Coalition, particularly for the United States. So ultimately, there are certain limitations on what Israel can do insofar as whether they've got tacit approval from the United States or not. So I'll be able to tell you what Israel would plausibly be allowed to do or granted by the United States.
Go on.
Ultimately, will be, kind of more of the same in terms of over the past number of years in terms of shadow war operations. So that's assassinations on, let's say, nuclear scientists within Iran, if not attacks on nuclear facilities, although that could be a potential red line. That's more...
As a general rule, blowing up nuclear facilities is probably not to be encouraged.
No, of course not. But then again...
That's the problem with Raymond's analysis, is that if you're seeing it from an exclusively Israeli point of view, then you would think, we must blow up those facilities. But what the hell is going to happen if you drop a bomb on a nuclear plant? The radiation ramifications would be unthinkable.
Yeah, look, I don't think we're there, and I think
surgical strikes.
Outside observers need to kind of take stock that I think on both the part of on Iran's part and Israel's part, for that matter, is that they are both very calculated actors.
Yes.
They know exactly what they're doing. They know how to calibrate their response. I mean, just take the attack on the consulate in Damascus as an example.
Yeah.
They literally struck with such precision. Do you know, I think this might be lost on Western media. Do you know what's next door to the Iranian consulate in Damascus?
Go on.
The Canadian embassy.
Gosh.
And it was literally left untouched. So this is the building's still there. It's like it's literally, you know.
Would it be nice to see some of that technology deployed? Well, not nice, but preferable to see some of that technology deployed in Gaza, perhaps. A lot of people listening will be thinking that, won't they?
This is the thing. We keep getting told that, you know, Israel's got these really exact, precise weapons, but then again, we've got dumb bombs being used. But anyhow,
here's the reason why. And what you've got is 4 or 5 examples to prove your precedent, and all I've got to challenge it is some words.
Please, yeah.
Some words that were said by Benny Gantz, but I think they were carefully chosen words. And he talked about building a regional coalition, which just possibly entertains the notion of cocking a snook at Joe Biden, possibly while waiting to see what the result of the American presidential election would be. But that aside, the very specific choice of the words regional coalition just slightly challenges your confidence that everything would need America's approval.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from, but the regional states are in a bind. They're in a catch-22. Like, let's take
yes, of course.
Take the Jordanian state as an example. They participated in part of the defense against the missiles that came in. But that's not good PR for the Jordanian state on the ground. 2/3 of the Jordanian population are of a Palestinian diaspora background. That does not run well. Despite what's gone on over the weekend, it's not going to be easy for Israel to wash its hands of over 30,000 deaths, and we're looking at 100,000.
I think Iran have accused Iraq as well, haven't they, of being active in trying to block those drones over their own airspace bound for Israel.
Yeah, I mean, the Iran-Iraq relationship is quite fraught and tenuous, because Iraq is really in a catch-22 because Iraq is one of the few countries in the world that's an ally of the United States and Iran at the same time, so work that one out.
And just to finish with the Jordanian angle, which you're right is incredibly nuanced and complicated. Their foreign minister has said overnight the first step towards de-escalation is ending the Israeli aggression on Gaza and starting to implement the two-state solution, which Netanyahu's not going to entertain in a month of Sundays.
James, I spoke to you just after October the 7th, and I said when all said and done, it's going to come back round to a political solution. You know, despite all the smoke and bluster, warmongering, kind of...
It's gravity, isn't it? I'm cracking on just because it's the news. And, of course, it falls to me to remind you, not you, Hassan, but everybody else, that the people most committed to or most opposed to a two-state solution are currently running both Hamas and Israel. And doesn't change the inevitability of what Hassan describes. It just prolongs the agony for all involved, perhaps. 11:30 is the time. Jenny Barsby is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:34 is the time. We will hear from Professor Anthony King a little later on what an actual war might look like. I have to choose my words carefully and indeed, of course, responsibly. But it seems to me to be a valid question. Before that, a couple more of your calls, or a few more of as many calls as you want, really, the time allowing, on what would be gained by an escalation when a member of the Israeli War Cabinet talks about building a regional coalition and exacting the price from Iran for the events of this weekend, for the attack, multiple attacks on Israel this weekend. So that's question number one. What's the win? What's the gain? What would it achieve? But the second question is, how do you avenge an attack which thankfully killed nobody? All of these conversations since October the 7th have focused on death tolls, horribly. The 1,200 killed by Hamas in Israel, the upwards of 30,000 killed by Israel in Gaza. How do you avenge an attack that killed nobody? And I hope that's not... I don't think that is an unnecessary question. I think it's a really important one. You say, why did you kill those people over there? Because they attacked us and didn't kill anyone. I don't know. I'm just wondering what it might look like. 11:25 is the time. A little more on that story that Jenny just broke the news of in her bulletin. It's Remarkable, really, although very much of our times, isn't it? That the congregation, the church service, which was apparently or definitely interrupted by an attacker, was actually being broadcast live on the church's YouTube page at the time. It shows Bishop Mary Emmanuel looking up in astonishment as the attacker suddenly rains down blows upon his face and head. It was at the Christ the Good Shepherd Church in Wakeley. The assailant was jumped on by members of the congregation, which at this early stage probably explains why there are reports of at least 2 others allegedly being stabbed as well. That would be in the ensuing tussle. But given the events at the Westfield Bondi Junction, of course, just 48 hours ago, this story inevitably will have sent yet another shiver through the collective population of Australia and wider and further beyond, of course. But a bishop and several worshippers, or at least 2 worshippers, have been attacked in another stabbing to rock the city of Sydney in Australia, and it happened at the Christ the Good Shepherd Church in Wakeley. More on that as and when we have the information. Back to Netanyahu. Ash is in Hornchurch. Ash, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, mate.
I just want to tackle a question that you've kind of raised over and over again on your show. It's just, what...
You make it sound boring, Ash. I have to repeat. Not everybody's sitting there for 3 hours hanging on my every word. I have to remind people what we're talking about.
No. It's not boring at all, but it's come up so many times that I thought I'd sort of phone in and weigh in on it. But mostly it's what's going through Netanyahu's mind.
Yes.
And I feel like I think you're a good person. Most people listening are good people. And I think we take the basic morality that people have for granted. And I think I find it a little bit easier to look at it from the other point of view, because I think I'm kind of deficient in basic morality myself. If you think of him as a self-serving creature, as a philosophy of me and mine before you and yours, I think what he's doing makes complete sense, right? He's looking after his country first, and then if he can't look after his country, then he's looking after his own political ambitions first. And morality be screwed. I don't know what words I can use. When you look at it like that, when you look at his actions from that, it really makes perfect sense. What's so difficult about that to understand? He's going to long this war out as long as he possibly can. If he can get more of territory in Gaza or whatever he can do, that's great, right? If he can move the political ambitions of his country forward, that's fantastic. And if he can't do that, which I feel like that's how he started this, didn't he?
Yeah.
He started off with trying to move the political ambitions of his country forward. And then when he realized that he himself was in hot water, he was like, you know what, screw the country. It's time for me to look after myself. Best way to do that is to get into as many wars or get into as many problems, as we can, and then that'll keep me in power. If you look at it from that point of view, doesn't it all just make sense? What's so difficult, at that point to understand? Forget morality. Forget how many people are dying. Forget all of that.
I won't forget all of that. I can't. But and I know you didn't. I know you didn't mean it. No, I know you didn't.
He can.
Yes, in a callous sense, but he wouldn't be able to do it without support. So even if your analysis is correct, and it is motivated even more than perhaps the broader coverage acknowledges by self-interest on the part of Benjamin Netanyahu. Gantz and Gallant, the other members of the war cabinet, significant swathes of Likud, the Knesset, the broader Israeli population, he will have support for an awful lot of what he decides to do. So his personal motivation becomes moot. If he lacks support, whether it's electoral or policy specific, he won't be able to do things. That he will run out of road, to use a phrase.
Yeah, but then that's where we come into the sort of broader sentiment of me and mine before you and yours, right? Yes. So everyone in his party is thinking about that. That's sort of just, the same way that you mentioned on your show just a couple of days ago that 3 British, people dying. Just that hit a lot harder
Yes.
close to home, didn't it? And yet you are, I'm not criticizing you, sorry, don't think of it as that, but you're the same person who always says, a Palestinian baby, the death of a Palestinian baby is the same as the death
Well, it
of
is to me, but for most people
absolutely.
contributing to this conversation, it doesn't quite work like that, does it?
And yet, the 3 British people dying, it woke a lot of people up. So, it's. I feel like the same thing's happening over in Israel. Me and mine before you and yours. That's sort of the sentiment. And the thing is, and again, I don't want to do this on live radio, but it's a sentiment that I can understand. People look after their own best interests. Many of us would perhaps, at least there are some of us that would probably go to extreme lengths to serve our own interests. But you know what stops us? Consequences, repercussions, laws, rules. If we don't hold him accountable, he can do what he sees fit. What's stopping me from coming into your house and taking what you have for the betterment of me and my family? Laws, rules.
And that's where perhaps Kay Burley's question, I don't know if you heard it earlier, about what would the UK do if another country were to attack one of our consulates, one of our diplomatic compounds in a foreign country, was actually a really, really brilliant question, because David Cameron didn't pause for long enough before answering, well, we would respond very... I'll play you the clip again, and that's the point. This is what stops countries from doing things that are or may be in contravention of international law. This is Kate. I'm going to play it to you again because I think everyone needs to hear it. And you reminded me when you came on that not everyone will have heard it the first time round.
A reckless and dangerous thing for Iran to have done. And I think the whole world can see all these countries that have somehow wondered, well, what is the true nature of Iran? It's there in black and white.
What would Britain do if a hostile nation flattened one of our consulates?
Well, we would take the very strong action.
And Iran would say that that's what they did?
Well, what they did, as I said, was a massive attack.
So they were right to respond, but they overreacted, is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that the attack they carried out was on a very large scale, much bigger than people accepted.
They have a right to respond?
Well, countries have a right to respond when they feel they've suffered an aggression. Of course they do. But look at the scale of that response. Had those weapons not been shot down,
respond, but they just overreacted.
There could have been thousands of casualties, including civilian casualties. I think that's a really important point to take into account.
It is 11:43. I just leave that up there as an illustration of the impossibility of being able to make the kind of sweeping statement that you need to be able to make for Ash's description of consequences to apply. You have to say, if you do X, then Y will follow, and Y will prevent you from doing X, either again or as a sort of preemptive deterrent. It means you wouldn't do X in the first place. Aaron is in Watford. Aaron, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I just wanted to say it's the same sort of thing that happened to me, how the news broadcast this, as what happened in October with Hamas. Like, this was all the beginning of the stuff. Look at big bad Iran doing, but you need to remember even if you just look at the last 5 years, Israel have done cyber attacks on Iran. They've killed their lead scientist. They've bombed lots of international law over Lebanon, killing their military advisors. This has been going on for years. And Iran's never done anything about it. And then, one day, maybe it's the stick that broke the camel's back. Iran have retaliated. And now it's, look at big bad Iran. Poor Israel. There's consequences to actions. And they've been doing this. And now you might say, well, they did all of that in response of Iran backing Hezbollah and backing Hamas. But again, the only reason Hezbollah and Hamas were created was because Israel invaded Lebanon and Gaza in the first place. That's the only reason they're there. It's not because, they were just there.
You're not really attempting to answer any of the questions that I've asked. What would be gained by Netanyahu?
Okay, so the gaining of Netanyahu, one, he's going to now be able to finish off in Gaza. He can say, they're backed rebels. He's fighting in Iran. He's fighting them in Gaza. He'll be able to go back and attack Hezbollah because he's fighting Iran in Hezbollah. And I really believe that I
don't think that stands up to scrutiny, really, Aaron. So, you think that Iranian intervention will stop Joe Biden and others insisting or calling upon Netanyahu not to go into Rafah, or I mean, David Cameron talking this morning about an increased chance of a truce. You see it from
David Cameron,
the opposite
he didn't turn
way
around and condemn something.
No, again, that's got nothing to do with what I'm asking you. You might have a lot of stuff that you want to get off your chest, but you have to wait until I ask a question to which the stuff on your chest is an answer, Aaron.
Yeah, sure.
It's pretty straightforward. Most observers seem to think that this weekend may, and certainly people in Gaza also, may actually accelerate some form of truce, whereas you see it as a precursor for an escalation in Gaza, not beyond.
I do. I think if Netanyahu had his way, then I do see it as a
and this increases his chances of getting his way, because it once again, after a few months of Israel looking very much like an almost unchallenged aggressor, for good or for ill, that's how it's appeared to outside observers, we are all once again reminded of, and you might not like this analysis, but we are once again reminded of the existential threat under which everybody in Israel lives every day. And I come back to this point again and again and again. And, Aaron's not the first person to try to give us a history lesson about the status of the West Bank, the status of the Gaza Strip, the status of Lebanon itself. But the bottom line is that there are entities in the Middle East dedicated to the eradication of the modern state of Israel. And you cannot understand anything Israel does unless you view it through that lens. And it's very, very important to keep that lens in front of you. It's 11:47. And Steve's the first one to raise the Salman Rushdie incident as well. Anybody under any illusions about what the state of Iran, what the modern state of Iran represents and does, the idea that it never kind of intervenes in matters beyond its own boundaries, Aaron, is palpably absurd. I had dinner with Salman Rushdie last month, and I can tell you now the consequences of the fatwa that were issued against him are in full view whenever he shows his face in public. It's 11:47. I'm going to get a guest on next. We don't usually, but I did say to you on Friday, sometimes you need a bit of help from people who do this for a living. Anthony King wrote Urban Warfare in the 21st Century. He's a professor of defence and security studies at the University of Exeter. And I probably shouldn't tell you this, but sometimes I say to Eleanor, can you just check this isn't a stupid question? Can you check with the expert that he thinks this is a question? Because I'm really interested in what a war would actually look like, because it's almost like a robot war over the weekend. That the idea that, a drone, what they've called a kamikaze drone, that's one a bit of AI, gets taken out by another bit of AI, with thankfully no human involvement at all. And as we've mentioned a couple of times, thankfully no deaths after this Iranian attack. There is a young Bedouin girl still in a critical condition in hospital, and others injured as well. But if there were an escalation, people other than me have used the word war, what would that look like? Ukraine has reminded us of what 20th century war looks like, where you have incremental gains of territory and losses and a sort of toing and froing of armed humans. Would an escalation in the Middle East be a 20th century war, or indeed a 21st century war? And if it's the latter, what on earth will that look like? We'll find out after this.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:52, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. So words. I wonder which word has been the most nuanced since the terror attack of October the 7th. We probably started with proportionate, didn't we, or disproportionate, a word that covers so much ground that you end up realising that no one's really entirely sure what's meant by it, or at least that two people using the same word don't agree on what the word means. Escalation would be the word today. Escalation, people using the word escalation, what does it mean? We know what war means. Or at least we have a fairly clear idea about what war means. It wasn't just robots shooting robots out of the sky last night. Jets were in the air, including British jets, Jordanian jets. So, human beings flying aeroplanes that were shooting down missiles and kamikaze drones that had been programmed by or launched by human beings. But if escalation leads to war, then what would war between Israel and Iran, or broader regional coalitions, what would it look like? Anthony King is a professor of defence and security studies at the University of Exeter and the author of the book Urban Warfare in the 21st Century. Is this a question that we can even answer, Anthony, or begin to answer?
Well, I think it's a really pertinent question, personally. I mean, I think, it's absolutely the question to answer today and this week. I mean, in terms of a war between Israel and Iran, which is one which, I mean, I completely agree with Biden and David Cameron that we really want to avoid this if we possibly can. I mean, this would be a terrible, terrible outcome. But I think you can look at and predict some of the contours of that war. I mean, just before the break, you highlighted Russia-Ukraine war, this terrible sort of attritional thing. And I think, the war that might occur or the increased conflict between Iran and Israel would look very different. It wouldn't be in any way so territorial. The two countries are not contiguous with each other. But what I would anticipate, and if you put it in a longer term perspective, so there's been a low grade, but periodically quite intense conflict between Israel and Iran. It's consisted of a number of things. Strikes on Iranian operatives and facilities in Syria and other places, and in fact sometimes in Iran itself, and some of those strikes are physical, some are covert assassinations, and some are cyber attacks. And I think what you'd get is an intensification of those three elements: air attacks, rocket attacks from Israel to Iran, cyber attacks, and in retaliation, air and rocket attacks back, and probably Hezbollah activated in Lebanon to fight across the Lebanese-Israeli border. The really dangerous thing, I think, for the West and for the world is the maritime dimension. I mean, we've already seen that. Iran seized an Israeli-based ship last Saturday, and I think that is where the escalation of a conflict would come in, because it would be very difficult for the UK, for the US, for the West not to be dragged into some maritime struggle around the Red Sea and the Gulf. And so I think these dimensions of an air maritime conflict with some territorial fighting in Lebanon, if it really went up to that level, I'm hopeful it will not. But that's where I think you would see the conflict and the war developing, or a war developing.
And what would the end look like?
Well, I've got to say at this point, I would be deeply pessimistic. I mean, right from the 7th of October, the potential of that atrocity to create a regional conflict was high, in my view, and it would, the end point of if Israel do retaliate, and of course the security minister have said there will be a massive retaliation. I think we move into a domain that we've not really seen, of instability for decades. I mean, it reminds me of the Gulf War of 1991. The potential there for regional conflict with Saddam's invasion of Kuwait and the reaction. The major bit of political strategic work that was done at that point was to prevent Israel from getting into that war. Those of us who are older will remember the attempt to stop the Scuds firing, because that was the way that Israel was going to be drawn into the war. And we're back there in that level of danger, but we're way beyond it, because there is already a war going on in Gaza and effectively a low-grade maritime conflict in the Gulf and around the Red Sea. So, I'm certainly not alarmist.
No,
but I would be deeply concerned about an Israeli retaliation, which seemed to have no strategic purpose. Because what are they going to do?
You've preempted my next question, which is, what would it achieve? What would the strategic purpose be?
What you see directing Israeli strategy, in inverted commas, since the 7th of October is a combination of understandable requirement for revenge. Terrible attacks, consistent, sponsored by and a consistent pressure by Iran, a regime which you rightly said is dedicated to the liquidation of Israel. But I cannot see how strategically a retaliation would work. I mean, the attack yesterday was a demonstration. I mean, the Iranian senior leaders it totally said it was a demonstration. They had to respond to the 1st of April attacks. This is the demonstration. Honour is settled. An own senior politician said, right, it's mission accomplished, the operation is over, so sort of honour settled. But I mean, a retaliation, the attacks that Israel had mounted on Iran up till now, since 2010, have been very precise. Missile sites, certain port facilities, certain individuals, nuclear scientists have been assassinated, certain nuclear facilities, the Natanz facility being most famous. But I don't see what a widening of bombing and missile strikes would remotely do, or cyber attacks would remotely do for Israel, beyond encouraging another escalation when they are already overcommitted in Gaza. So, it is a concerning situation. I think the balance is which wing of the Netanyahu government will
prevails. Finally, Anthony, did Israel or indeed anybody learn anything from the Iranian offensive? Did they demonstrate capabilities that were previously unconfirmed, or was it, with 72 hours worth of notice and a full understanding of what the Iron Dome could achieve, did it unfold more or less entirely as everybody would have expected?
I think so.
Right.
I think that's right. I mean, the issue is, though, with these air attacks is, as we've shown in Ukraine, is they use a lot of munitions to defeat them. How long can you sustain that if the attacks go on days, weeks, months? And that's the only question I think that Israel need to ask themselves before initiating a counterstrike.
Professor Anthony King, many thanks. Professor of War Studies at the University of Exeter. Always a very helpful guide through these matters. And you may have noticed sometimes I like to get the guest on at the end as a sort of punctuation mark to the conversations and the contemplations that we have had together. Professor of Defence and Security Studies, I beg your pardon, not War Studies, at the University of Exeter, and his book Urban Warfare in the 21st Century is a seminal text. Last word on this, I think. Please stop referring to the terrorist regime that took Iran hostage as Iran, James. They do not represent the people of Iran and should be referred to as such. In the same way that you refer to the terrorists in Gaza as Hamas, the same principle should be applied as well to these. The mullahs will do, but not Iran. They are the worst of the worst, the enemy of their own people and the rest of the world, and there should be no confusion or misinterpretation of their goals and the dirty tricks they use to achieve them, including perhaps starting a full-on war with Israel. Thank you for that. I think it's a helpful reminder. I'll do my best. I always do.
James O'Brien on LBC.
5 minutes after 12 is the time. Change of pace, change of gear, change of topic. Do you want to know what the other contenders were? I told you some time ago that we must almost make a date. We should probably set a timer in our diary for conversations about AI. We got very excited at first. I don't know if you were listening at the time. Oh, goodness me. And then people put me into it, and we could do a monologue in the style of James O'Brien. And then it was very verbose and pompous. And I mean, I don't know who on earth could possibly have thought that sounded anything like me. It was very curious. It wasn't verbose or pompous at all. I'm doing self-deprecation there, which I'm not sure AI would be capable of. Or then, it probably is now. And then we were struck within the space of about 2 months by how quickly it was going. And now it all seems to have gone very quiet again. So we were going to have a look at a story about bosses revealing that they were fearful of being replaced by AI. But in the meantime, we're still using it to replace other employees. Using it to help with their own role and then pass off the work as their own. There is a conversation to be had there at some point. I just don't think that it is necessarily today. And the other one, I'm telling you now, this just if the news were tea leaves, then my ability to read the tea leaves is much better than my ability to know what a story is when it appears in front of me. I'm good at spotting growing momentum behind a story. I increasingly think that either this government or the next one is going to have a proper swing at social media for under 16s. I know that Michelle Donnellan is looking at stopping children from buying phones. I think that's a little bit ridiculous, to be honest with you. But that conversation we had in the last hour about the relationship between actions and consequences, these massive companies are never, ever, ever going to do anything unless they are forced to. And the only way you can force them to is through fear of prison or massive financial penalty. And I just have a feeling that the time might be right. The planets might be aligning for one or other or both of those consequences to be put into place with regard to letting under-16s onto social media platforms. Although I say that on a Monday, I think it was on Friday that it was announced that one of them had reduced the age for eligibility from 16 to 13. So, I wouldn't bet your house on it if I were you. So, here's an interesting thing. An interview with Michael Grade, who is the chairman of Ofcom. He's also a former chairman of ITV, and he was a chair of the board at the BBC as well. He is, in a nutshell, one of the most highly qualified television executives that this country has ever seen, from of course, a dynasty of impresarios and heavy hitters. And he's been talking about television becoming more exploitative and cruel in a bid to chase down viewers. It sounds like an interesting interview, this. The exploitation dial has been switched up more and more for ratings. Television has also become patronising in the sense of this will do for the audience. There's no mind at work behind it, no real craft, just bread and circuses. He hasn't ruled out any single programmes. He hasn't singled out, I beg your pardon, any programmes. But it's hard to read his words without suspecting that reality shows are near the top of the tree, talking about the public entertaining themselves. I love telly. I really love telly. In fact, John's just been in touch to say thank you for recommending One Day last week, which he has become for the first time in his life a binge watcher. Thank you for that, John. I think we'd have binge watched it as well if it wasn't a lot going on. I finished it off the other night. The last 2 episodes absolutely destroyed me. And now I've started on This Town, which is a BBC drama set in Birmingham at the sort of Scar era, and I'm 2 episodes into that. It's absolutely brilliant. There's a new one starting on May the 1st. They're turning one of my favourite books into a drama. I think that one's on Disney Plus. The Shard Lake Mysteries, the C.J. Sampson's Shard Lake Mysteries. There's loads. I love telly, but I also love telly. You know, like old episodes of Friends or Match of the Day or The One Show. I love The One Show. I just love telly. I don't know why. I love telly in a way that's quite odd. Now, I love the Antiques Roadshow. I love the Antiques Roadshow. Turns out I'm not alone. The Antiques Roadshow is enjoying an incredible surge of popularity at the moment. It's not hard to see why. But what I mean by loving telly is I don't just love content. I love telly. I love the language of television. I'm still quite terrestrial. Not terrestrial, but what's it called? No, not analog. There's a word for it. Linear. I'm still quite linear. Thank you, Keith. I heard that word for the first time at the Hay Festival a few years ago. And I was on stage at the time. I had to pretend I knew what they were talking about. And I didn't have the first I said, well, I haven't watched linear. One of the guests said, I haven't watched linear television since 2003. And I went, oh, yes, linear television. What the heck is linear television? I've got no idea what linear television. So, much against my instincts, I stayed out of that bit of the conversation and I let it unfold without me. But I love telly. And I don't know that Grade has got this right. I think it's got a little bit better recently. The problem, or the reason why I'm stressing that I love telly, is because I don't watch much of the stuff that he is probably alluding to. I've got daughters who enjoyed Love Island for about a series and a half and then got bored of it. I was a showbiz journalist, would you believe, when Big Brother started, or certainly in Big Brother's pomp. And that was bizarre. That was bizarre, seeing members of the public become overnight some of the proper celebrities. It hasn't really lasted, has it, with a couple of glorious exceptions. But the late Jade Goody, for example, bless her, was propelled into extraordinary levels of celebrity and fame, while it could easily be argued being exploited. But the stuff I was thinking of more this morning was more like, do you remember Benefit Street? It became known as poverty porn. That I thought was much more exploitative than anything on reality television. And it was designed in part to provide the kind of, what would the word be? To provide the kind of gristle for people that's normally the Daily Mail's job. You'd actually be using real people to whip up the sort of hatred that the Daily Mail usually whipped up by writing an article, admittedly about a real person, but they would then pretend that real person was representative of everybody unemployed or everybody on disability benefit. It was just unpleasant. It was really unpleasant. And I don't know whether or not Michael Grade is right about this, whether things have got worse or whether they've got better. But what I do know is that, and Gogglebox is a mad one as well, isn't it? Because on paper, Gogglebox is an absolutely appalling idea. Imagine pitching that. So what we're going to do, we're going to film people watching telly. Do you think the Gogglebox would ever have got made if the royal family hadn't come first? I've got no idea what the pitching process involved, but the royal family essentially involved us watching people watch television. Almost all of the action on the royal family unfolded with them all sitting on the sofas with Anthony on the end in the chair while watching another programme on television, and the interactions were so. I wonder whether actually there is a sort of family tree on which Gogglebox is in fact a descendant of the royal family. All they did was obviously replace beautifully, incredibly well scripted comedy written by the late Caroline Aherne with very, very heavily edited exchanges between real people. And by edited, I don't mean they're misleading you. I just mean they film a heck of a lot in order to get enough to make a good programme. So on paper, that should never have worked. I don't think Gogglebox is exploitative at all. But watching other people, watching strangers watch TV is, if you've never watched it, it's TV gold. So I do think that what passes for TV entertainment now is a million miles away from what was normal when we were growing up. But I don't know that it's necessarily reality television that's the problem. What I want you to do, and this is a bit of a weird question for someone that's normally attacking the Daily Mail for moral panics and claiming that everything's worse now than it ever was before. What I want you to do now is tell me the moment on the telly where you felt something got lost, like a new low. I hope this works. So you're watching telly or you're looking back on telly and something that you thought you were very surprised to find yourself feeling a bit like Mary Whitehouse. Even though you're a great advocate of free speech, even though you see yourself as quite liberal in terms of culture, even though you are not a fan of censorship or any of those things, you just remember a moment on the television, where you just felt something was being lost. The pursuit of what Michael Grade describes as bread and circuses, no real craft, making television that almost exploits the viewer as much as it exploits the person on the screen being exploited for the delectation of the brother. But not the program, but the moment. Okay? So the moment on the television where you would point to prove Michael Grade's point. So Michael Grade says television has become exploitative and cruel. He talks about it becoming patronising, about it having no real craft. It's just bread and circuses. What would you offer up? It can be a programme in general, but I'd much rather have a specific moment of, and then hopefully other people might be able to defend it. But to start with, what would you offer up as evidence for the prosecution? The prosecution of Michael Grade's case that television has become exploitative and cruel. What would you offer up as proof? Go on, have a think. 0345 6060 973. Because the reason why I went off on a slightly odd tangent about loving television was because I always get defensive. People talk like this. I always get defensive when people say, oh, telly's awful these days, or they think it's low rent. I had a lovely interview with Julie Hesmondhalgh last week, which will come out on Full Disclosure soon. And she, of course, played Hayley in Coronation Street. And she talked very lyrically about the role that soap operas play. And we've touched on the snobbery behind soap operas on this programme in the past as well. I hate snobbery about television. For many people, the only cultural fix you're going to get easy access to in your life is television. And to see it, that's why I love these new dramas that are unfolding now, albeit that the cost of subscriptions can make some of them hard to access. But I hate the way that television is sometimes talked about as a sort of low rent outlet, but on this occasion, Michael Grade has probably got a point. So either a programme or a moment, a specific moment that proves Michael Grade, in your opinion, is right when he claims that television has become more exploitative and cruel than ever before. Shall we get the phone lines open? And you're not allowed to include any ill-advised television project to which I may have contributed at some point in the dim and distant past. Although I did do one show that probably could be described as exploitative and cruel, which is why I didn't do it for very long. 12:17 is the time. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need.
James O'Brien on LBC.
20 minutes after 12, and no criticism. It means I haven't done my job very well, but I'm not looking for latter-day Mary Whitehouses. It's not about lots of swearing or violence on TV, or someone's complaining about The Walking Dead. It's literally a zombie movie. Of course there are going to be like squished heads all over the place and stuff like that. It's not about that, because no one could describe that as exploitative and cruel. You see, just as language has become more profane over the years, exploitative and cruel probably involves programs featuring members of the public. Or in fact, almost certainly. I don't know how can it be exploitative if it's not involving members of the public? And there is a contract here. I used to work in the studios next door to Trisha that became Jeremy Kyle, made by the same company that I worked for about 18 months in Norwich. And the mad thing about Jeremy Kyle was that everybody on it really wanted to be on it. There were occasions when people would get nervous or have a sort of change of heart. But for many of the people that appeared on that programme and became a laughingstock in some senses, or became pantomime villains in some senses, that they really wanted to be on it. So I don't know where exploitation ends and consent begins, or indeed vice versa. But let's have a look at what you think. Well, I'll tell you what, we've got, in terms of an actual show, we've got a clear winner. I was going to do it as a hook and tease, but Eleanor has decided to put through the first caller talking about exactly the show that I was going to use as a hook and tease, by saying at the end of this hour, I'll tell you which show has, by a country mile, ended up as the one that you've cited first as a new low in exploitation and cruelty. And it's a show I have only watched in passing, and I thought I was watching some sort of parody. I thought I'd accidentally tuned into an experiment that I didn't understand. I suppose I should introduce William in Forest Hill, and we should actually get on with the business of working out what that show is and whether or not it is exploitative and cruel. William, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, you invited people to say what their kind of idea was in terms of television. Preface this, I love television like you. Yeah. Linear television is where you can't stop it and rewind while you have a cup of tea, which you can with streaming. That's very clear. They're both great. There's amazing streaming. You go onto linear, it's like going down a rarely travelled country road.
Well, you still can. I mean, technically, just for the pedants out there, it's like Global Player. You can pause it and rewind it, but I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
I'm not technically adept enough to do for that. I'm an old geezer, and
Go on. So what's the nadir? What's the lowest of the low?
I think you guessed it. It's Naked Attraction. It's after the watershed. You turn it on, and it's a parade of male and female genitals. And I'm 66 years old. I never thought in my lifetime of somewhat prudish upbringing, TV, Blue Peter, I would turn on the television and I would see a vagina. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah.
Okay, a vagina, a penis, testicles, being narrated.
It's like, these are all the words that 8-year-olds look up in the dictionary.
Absolutely. It's just...
For people who haven't seen it, you should probably clarify that you can't see anything else.
No, well, they sort of mask the body. You can, James, because I think you claim to have watched it accidentally, but I've watched it quite a few times.
But I thought you could only see the genitals. You can't see the face and stuff, can you? Doesn't it?
No, you can, yeah. There's a point in the show where you see the whole body.
No, I know, but at the beginning, you only see the genitals.
Yeah, and of course, that's all you're looking at anyway, so... And then they bring it's a dating show. It's basically a naked
dating
show.
So you're choosing people according to the aesthetics of their private parts.
I think that's 60% of the choice. And it might have something to do with personality or
it's quite obvious.
Height or
why is this? Why is this the lowest of the low? Because you could argue that it was addressing the taboo of nudity, that we're quite a prudish post-Victorian society. I bet it wouldn't work in France or Germany or countries where nudity is quite commonplace. So why?
Okay, I'll tell you why I object to it, because it reduces people to the level of dogs sniffing each other's genitals.
Well, you've gone there, yeah.
I think humans are more than animals. I object to the fact that it justifies itself with Ofcom on the basis that it's a sex education programme.
Does it?
It isn't a sex education programme, it's pure voyeurism.
It's just a reason. Would anybody watch it for reasons other than voyeurism, vicarious?
No,
I mean, hang on a minute, you said you've watched it a lot. Why do you watch it then?
I don't know, because I'm human and I guess I'm weak.
You're hypnotised.
I'm hypnotised, and I kind of can't believe what I'm watching, and I've actually phoned a friend and I've said...
No, that's Who Wants to Be a Millionaire.
Yeah, sure. I mean, why?
You phoned a friend and said, are you watching this?
Yeah, can you believe it?
It's just extraordinary.
It's just because it does break the taboo about showing genitals, which is pretty much universally applied in almost every medium. And this is television. I mean...
No, okay, so if we had Michael Grade here and we forced him to pick one programme, this is a contender for looking at the language he's used. This must be a contender. There's no real craft. See, what you're doing is picking up on the fact that the programme makers claim, apparently, as you've told us, that it has some sort of educational purpose. But he would say there's no real craft. It's just bread and circuses.
This education is 3 out of 4 women in an unnamed survey.
Oh, they do that, do they?
Yeah, but say that they think men with red hair are sexy. That's the science. That's the science. That's education. It's complete.
Yeah, no, I mean, as I say, it's not something that I've made an appointment to watch. But when I've caught it, I've been actually stunned. But are we really going to do Anna in Liverpool on the same programme? We're supposed to be assembling. Thank you, William. Anna, we're supposed to be assembling a rich tapestry of dreadful moments in exploitative television, but you're here with the same programme, I think.
I am, James.
Now,
with Naked Attraction, I didn't get it at first, but speaking to my kids who were teenagers at the time, they explained to me it wasn't really exploitative, and I watched it, and I did get it. It did have an educational side for young people.
What did you learn? For young people?
Yes, for the teenagers and for young people, they're just going out there and exploring the sexuality and everything. And I got that. Right. And I did watch it a couple of times, but there was one episode where a young lad, early 20s, it was a while ago, and he was looking at naked women.
On the show?
On the show.
Right.
He'd never been with a woman, and he was petrified, and he was petrified to the point where he ran out of the studio and he filmed that and broadcast that episode.
And he's fully clothed, is he? He's fully clothed?
He's fully clothed, and he was going up close to the women and asking them to describe body parts and stuff, and it was just so overwhelming for him. He got upset and ran out, and that crossed the line for me. It did, because I can't see the point of Naked Attraction, but that went too far.
Don't know. That was just cruel. We're supposed to be laughing at him at that point,
it exploited him. It really.
What's the difference there? What was it then about that? Because you crossed the line there. You were comfortable with the programme until that point, so it doesn't actually consign the entire project to the description that Michael Grade uses. But it's that decision, that editorial decision, to not edit that out or to not start filming again, or to and he'd have signed a release form, and he may have agreed to it subsequently or not, or but we'll never know. But what was it about that? Because that's educational as well. That shows you what it's like to be exposed to nudity when you are inexperienced, or when you could make a stronger case for that being educational than you could for a normal episode of the show, maybe, if you wanted to.
It just went too far with that lad.
Because he was so
genuinely so overwhelmed and upset, and it just spoilt what I think they're trying to do, which is to remove any sort of stigma or enigma about bodies, because younger ones do get it. They see it differently to our age group, you know.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, that makes it. No, that does make it interesting. Actually, coming up to thank you, Anna. It's coming up to 12:30. This is someone who's clearly almost exactly my age. It's easy, James. That was the TV moment that was particularly cruel and exploitative. I was pulled up by my ears. Thank you, Chris Tarrant, and then flanned by the phantom flan flinger. I'll never forget it. That's from Jeremy. I went on Tiswas as well, actually. Although I was just in the crowd, I wasn't. I was one of the kids holding a little banner. But my mum was in the cage. The Phantom Flanfinger used to put parents in the cage, and my mum got put in the cage. I got a little bit of splash water when the Flanfinger threw a bucket of water at somebody. But it was. I mean, it's tongue in cheek that from Jeremy. But that was what's the word for Not Maverick. What's the word for television that was like Zoo TV? It was unheard of at the time, Tiswas. There was a kid on my street in Kiddie who wasn't allowed to watch it. In fact, they weren't allowed to watch ITV at all. But their dad wouldn't even make an exception so they could see us on Tiswas. They just thought it was corrupting. ITV was corrupting. That's in 1979, 1980. Good Lord. I wonder what he made of Naked Attraction. Tim Humphrey is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:33. Just listening to that, it's a mark of how mad everything's become. You've got Liz Truss calling for Donald Trump to be the next president of the United States of America. And it just washes over us now. As a former UK Prime Minister, I know, blink and you missed it. A former UK Prime Minister endorsing the presidential campaign of a man who lied about the last election, a man who essentially provoked an attempted coup, or certainly an armed insurrection against his own vice president, or involving his own vice president, and who today, I think, becomes the first ever former American president to step into the dock of a criminal court involving a case that involved a pornographic actress. And then up pops a former UK... You want evidence of the denigration of decency, of normality, in public life, in politics. It's hard to think of a better combination than Liz Truss and Donald Trump, isn't it? It's sort of straddling the Atlantic like titans of tawdriness. An actual former British Prime Minister. And Ian Dale has conducted that interview. It'll be on LBC at 7 o'clock this evening. But goodness me, it's so bad now that you don't notice it. So commonplace now that we've stopped clocking it. And the same with the Trump story. Could you imagine at any other point in history if a former American president was about to go on trial in New York over a case in which some facts are already known? So it's not even up for debate whether or not he was involved with the actress Stormy Daniels. I mean, goodness me, I've written a book about the breaking of Britain. Paperback's out on the 25th. How They Broke Britain is the title. But goodness me, some days I just sit here and I go, woof. Maybe that's how Michael Grade feels looking at television. That he's been involved in television for about 100 years. And maybe he just catches himself occasionally going, oh my God, I can't believe how far we've fallen. Maybe he had Naked Attraction on. Maybe he had something else on. I don't know. But maybe he, when he catches something exploitative and cruel on telly, actually stops for a moment to marvel at how far we've fallen in the way that we do with politics. And I just did it then in the bulletins. Liz Truss calling for Donald Trump to be president of America. And then some absolute gibberish. Did you know? You probably won't believe this. But she blamed, in a speech, she actually blamed, because I had to record the audiobook for the new chapter on Friday, and I got to a bit, and I thought, did this get checked? This sounds like something I've made up. She tried to blame the failure of her government on trans activists in the civil service. They actually used those words out loud. I just... Anyway, there we go. She's on with Ian at 7. Here's a hook and tease for you. Speaking about the denigration of British politics, which of the following politicians was photographed this weekend holding up promotional literature for his election campaign without apparently noticing that he'd managed to spell his own name wrong? Which of these British politicians, don't cheat if you already know the answer, which of these British politicians was photographed at the weekend touting election literature in which he'd managed to spell his own name wrong? Was it A, Jonathan Gullis? Was it B, Brendan Clark-Hyphen? Or was it C, 30p Lee Anderson? Which of those intellectual giants managed to get themselves photographed this weekend holding up election literature in which they'd managed to spell their own name wrong? Was it A, Jonathan C. Gullis? Was it B, Brendan Clark hyphen? Or was it C, 30p Lee Anderson? 12:37 is the time. Alex is in Tring. Alex, I nearly said question or answer. I don't know why. What made you pick up the phone?
Tell you the truth, when you were talking about a moment, and this was a moment. It was Big Brother's King.
Oh yeah, be careful what you say now. She was. Yeah.
I believe she. No. I just believe she was exploited.
Horribly exploited.
Honestly, I don't blame her.
No, nor do I.
I blame Big Brother.
That should never have been broadcast in any way, shape. We should never have known that happened, should we?
Yes. No. That's why I was really angry with it. Not because she can do whatever she wants. She is a person.
Of course.
But I mean, Davina McCall regretted it.
Did she say that?
You know, well, I sort of checked because I.
Oh, you know that. So you've chosen to out yourself. So you were an early. Were you on the very first one?
What, for Big Brother?
Yeah.
I think I watched it. Because I've only found out I've got ADHD, and watching Big Brother actually taught me about humans.
Wow.
So.
And that was the lowest of the low. That episode when she was I don't really want to say so on the radio.
No.
I don't think I need to.
We don't. But the incident shouldn't have been aired, so we shouldn't have known about it.
Exactly.
And no harm would have been done.
No, exactly. And so it is a bit like the last caller. So this poor lad in the studio who got overcome by the sight of naked women and ran out of the studio. That in and of itself isn't exploitative, but putting it out on the telly is. I thought you were someone else then. I thought you were another Alex who rings in quite a lot, who was on Big Brother in an early episode, but he doesn't ring from Tring. That's why I got confused. And why was it so wrong? Because it robbed her completely of dignity.
Yes, it's got no. It's for just a dramatic exposure effect. It's just for ratings.
Headlines and ratings. Not even ratings, it's more for headlines. I can't remember whether I was still on newspapers at the time or whether I'd already moved on, but it's not as if you'd get a visible boost in viewers, would you? Because normally this stuff happens in the live feed, you know, the show that's not the edited version, but then they chose to actually put it out, not to take it out. Yeah, I think you're right, actually. But I don't know if that fits in Michael Grade's analysis, because that was blooming ages ago. That was really, really a long time ago. Alex, thank you. I love that idea of using reality television as a way of familiarising yourself with sort of human interactions in a way that you can't in real life, because you don't have the opportunity of just watching and observing and absorbing and hopefully learning. 20-1 is the time. That idea when... what is it? What are we looking for then? So that was a young woman who was behaving in a very sexualized manner, and it was filmed, and it was awful. So that it's all sexualized at the moment, or linked to sexualization, because we've got the naked attraction, we've got that. What about other stuff? I see. When I was a kid, Terry Christian's show, The Word, used to encourage people to do really disgusting things simply because they wanted to be on the telly. In fact, I think the feature was called "I'll Do Anything to Be on TV, Me," or "I'll Do Anything to Be on TV," and it involved, I think, one bloke snogged an old lady who had no teeth or something like that. But she was obviously paid for her trouble. It was a bit like rugby pranks, really, or medical school pranks, like drink a pint of vomit. I don't think that was one of them, but they knew exactly what they were signing up for. So when does it become exploitative, I wonder? When does it become problematic? 12:41 is the time. Sue is in Pimlico. Sue, what would you put on my list? It's not a very long list at the moment. All I've got is Naked Attraction and Big Brother, and that's a bit obvious. But are you going to surprise us with something else?
Morning, James.
Hello,
yes,
Sue.
I actually had completely forgotten about Naked Attraction, and I would agree, absolutely ghastly, and I would be horrified if I found my grandchildren watching it. But,
Yes.
people
Well, not as
say
horrified
you
as they'd be if you turned up on it, Sue.
Absolutely. And, people say, well, you don't have to watch, but unfortunately people flick through channels, and that's when it comes
Go on,
up.
what's your nomination? What's your nomination?
My nomination is 24 hours in A&E, 24 hours with the bailiff, 24 hours in a police cell with the police, 24 hours I think they've just done on the M25 or M4 or something with the traffic people. The next thing, they're going to have 24 hours with your dentist, do we need this? And when you said, what's a eureka moment that you suddenly realised, I speak as someone who watches a fair amount of rubbish. I've watched Love Island, etc., and I understand the exploitation of people, and I sometimes quite agree. But those programmes, I think, are the pits. Who wants to be filmed at their most sad, uncomfortable? That's it.
I don't know that I agree. I think I think they're journalism.
But
they fly on the
watches
wall.
them?
There's no exploitation there.
No?
They're not being encouraged to do anything.
Okay,
They're not being, apart from contributing to the programme or agreeing to its broadcast. They're not. I watched one recent. They're not being encouraged to do anything that strips them of dignity that they might later regret, and it gives you a real insight into the difficulty of some of the jobs that are under scrutiny.
Well, I can see the point that you're making. What I'd like to know is, do they get paid?
Who?
the people,
the professionals.
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't have thought so.
Or does the National Health get paid for
there might be some
cameras?
sort of facilities fee, or there'll be some sort of contribution. But what is it you don't like about them? You just feel intrusive, do you? You feel that you're being voyeuristic,
I just don't,
encouraged to be voyeuristic.
Yeah, I mean, I live at the time when they started to have medical programs, in the old days, which shows my age. But, they had a really difficult operation and people were filmed and, people were in awe of the skill of the surgeons and everything. And now it's just getting cheaper and cheaper. And television is just getting worse and worse and worse. And it's unfortunate. But it is what it is.
It is what it is. No, I'm not putting that on the list. Not that my list matters. It's like Room 101, this, isn't it? We're consigning the worst of exploitative television to the depths of the depths of hell. But I watched one of those recently. They're not my top of my list of things to watch, but it was absolutely fascinating. It was about how they caught a sex offender, actually, who'd escalated from voyeurism. And they caught him and found stuff on his phone. I was riveted, absolutely riveted. It was brilliant television and brilliant police work as well. Win-win, if you like. It's 12:45.
James O'Brien on LBC.
12:48 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we are. I have a bit of a departure, really, from our normal sort of programme, but I am interested in the moments that... And in fact, we may have... done a disservice to the lady in Pimlico. Emma tells me that some of these shows are incredibly exploitative. I didn't really watch enough of them to sit in judgment. I just saw a particularly brilliant episode of 24 Hours in Custody. What's it called? 24 Hours in Police Custody, which was a really interesting investigation, but the bailiffs ones apparently can be really exploitative. Human misery. That's what you don't want to watch. And yet people do, because this stuff gets made. So she was probably talking more about that than she was about the one that I was thinking of. Karen, actually, I have not forgot my hook and tease. I was building it up. It's a really good one today as well. And it's an interesting mix of people. The problem is that if you guess the right answer, I have no way of knowing who's cheating and who's just based it on likelihood. Which of these politicians would be most likely to get themselves photographed holding up election literature on which they'd managed to misspell their own name? Is it A, Jonathan C. Gullis? Is it B, Brendan Clark Hyphen? Or is it C, 30p Lee Anderson? The split is pretty even at the moment, except for the winner, who's a little bit ahead of the other two. But I'll give you the answer before we go. So one of these politicians this weekend managed to get himself photographed holding up election literature in which he'd managed to misspell his own name. So the mistake is forgivable. It's highly unlikely that he wouldn't know how to spell his own name. Although in the case of the character concerned, not entirely impossible. Highly, highly, highly unlikely. But not to check, Especially before holding. Let me just check this before we hold it up, lads. But anyway, which one do you think it was? Jonathan Gullis, Brendan Clark-Smith, or Lee Anderson? 10-1 is the time. Nicola is in Great Missenden. Nicola, what made you pick up the phone?
My moment from that supports the Gregg case.
Yes.
It is a rather old one, and I'm afraid it's Big Brother, which has already been mentioned.
Yeah.
So sorry to be.
Well, it was a game
unoriginal.
changer. It was a huge game changer, wasn't it?
It was when Vanessa Feltz was filmed writing on the table and was sort of really ridiculed. And I just felt really uncomfortable at the time. I mean, this is a long time ago now, 20 years ago.
Yes.
But for moments, I just don't think that we should really be looking at situations where we've deliberately put someone under enormous pressure and then are kind of laughing at them because of their...
Was it a therapeutic technique? Was that something that she did to almost counsel herself in times of stress?
Yeah. I mean, the show is called Big Brother, so the clue is in the title, but they're not allowed to write or read or anything. And she's a journalist, isn't she? So she probably writes all the time.
Of course.
And so for her to have that withdrawn from her and then to feel miserable, but then to laugh at her in her response, I just kind of like don't want to see that. I just feel it's mean, and I don't think we should use meanness for entertainment.
Well, then there wouldn't be a lot left on telly, would there?
don't you think, though? You shouldn't use cruelty to laugh at. It's too...
What about the talent shows when they put on people who are, I mean, unbelievably poor?
Yeah, well, I would include that in...
Well, that's what I mean, Nicola. In your glory, under your glorious rule, all we'll have is News Round.
I just think we should...
And the Antiques Roadshow. No, even the Antiques Roadshow is probably too cruel for you, because the ones who pretend they aren't greedy, and they say, and how much is it worth? Oh, it's priceless to me. I don't care how it's worth 50p. Oh, flipping heck. That can be quite cruel as well, can't it? As well. But no, you're right. I didn't.
Maybe I'm too much of an idealist.
Idealist stroke snowflake.
Definitely. But I do think we should not be looking to...
No, it's just an interesting example, because I agree with the broader thrust of what you say. I just don't know. I don't remember the finer detail of that example. But I mean, TV people going on to a reality TV show arguably know more about what they're signing up for than anybody else does. But there's something about a moment of self-care, which is, I think, what you're describing. That she should obviously have been afforded the privilege of privacy, the right of privacy. Privacy shouldn't even be a privilege, but there it is. 12:53 is the time. Chris is in Wellingborough. Chris, what's on your list? What are you submitting for inclusion?
Well, I've got an interesting one, and it's a programme which is called Open House, the Great Sex Experiment.
Have you cleared this with the producer? Because it's not something that's popped up on my schedule.
Well, I'm hoping so.
It's on normal telly, is it?
Yeah, Channel 4.
Right.
Channel 4, 2 series of it there have been, apparently.
Okay, go on.
And it's been on TV in the past 24 months or so.
Yes.
And basically what happens is that couples who want to explore their sexuality a bit more sign up to go to some kind of rather explicit retreat, which is probably a hotel. And so they then sort of... sell themselves almost on an open market at an external barbecue. Say, do you fancy hooking up with those? And I fancy doing an orgy. Or I fancy
what's
doing
wrong with that?
And it's really, what's wrong with it? The part that I find is wrong with it is the fact that when it's broadcast, what happens is that some of the couples, their idea of going in there and having a great time turns into an absolute mess.
I'm sure.
I'd rather use other words, but I won't. Example, one couple who went in and he was having to watch his wife or girlfriend have sex with other people, and he thought, "What the hell am I doing here?"
Yeah, but he knew. This is a really interesting distinction, because they knew exactly what they were signing up for. So I don't think that counts as exploitative.
Well, I think the exploitative part of it is that his embarrassment and his shame upon himself was broadcast for all to see, as opposed to saying,
what was he expecting to happen when he agreed to be on a reality television show?
He was expecting it to work fantastically.
No, I know, but you're describing reality. You can't say, "Oh no, hang on, this reality is a bit too real. Please don't broadcast this."
Well, you could say that.
I am. I just did.
You just did. I just heard. Those are your words, and I'll write them down. But the other part of it is there's this sort of strange-haired psychologist woman who tries to promote them to do these interesting things all the time.
I just think in 2024 or even 2023, you've got, if this was like the first program in the genre, like the real, opening vanguard of reality television, you could just about assemble a case for saying this wasn't fair. But from what you've said, this program just does exactly what it says on the tin, and so I feel sorry for someone who's signed up for it and it's all gone a little bit south. But that's that's the television show. That's literally
what I'm saying is, I think the TV show is exploiting people's desire to get themselves out there on the world TV map.
There's literally nothing forcing them to be on telly. Literally nothing.
No. True, but apart from their own wish to have this 15 minutes of fame, which then goes completely horrible.
On reflection, it's turning into quite a good game, this. In fact, it wouldn't be a bad TV format. On reflection, I think that you would be included on Michael Grade's list. I think Michael Grade probably would think that programme was exploitative and cruel. So I've started looking at it all from the other end of the telescope, which was probably a mistake, by thinking about the people on it knowing what they were signing up for. But from a viewer's point of view, we are being encouraged to enjoy the discomfort, the misery.
And I think that's exactly where I was coming from.
And I think you're right. Well. I think you explained it perfectly. I just got there in the end. I can be a bit slow on the uptake sometimes, Chris. That's all.
Not at all. But I will also say, though, from your previous caller, things like Bargain Hunt, they're horrible. They're shocking.
It's the end of civilization as we know it. 12:57 is the time.
My mum loved Bargain Hunt.
He's joking. He's messing about. At that moment, I do the best bit on Antiques Roadshow is either when someone's not expecting it to cost a lot of money and it costs loads, or when someone's expecting it to cost loads and it costs buttons. I don't know why. Paul's in Solihull. Paul, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. First time caller. So a bit of a hook and tease. You remember you talked about the word a minute ago.
Yes.
Well, yeah. And it's called the Hopefuls, where people used to do disgusting things. And I do remember one old lady being subjected to some young lad licking her armpit in the name of entertainment.
But she got paid. So who's being exploited?
Well, probably the young lad.
Yeah.
Potentially.
But he got 500 quid, didn't he, if memory serves, or something like that?
Who was in charge of Channel 4 at the time and commissioned
Michael Grade. Well played. Oh, look at that.
Yeah.
Oh, we got a winner. Oh, well played. So are you sure it was him?
Yeah, well, he was late 80s to late 90s, I believe.
Well, you haven't checked before you came on. As the producer checked.
I know it's mystery hour, but I did look at Wikipedia before I...
Good, no, that's good. I'm glad you did. So he's complaining about exploitative. The man who brought you armpit licking, live geriatric armpit licking, is now complaining about... He was the chief executive of Channel 4 from 88 to 97, which I think would be in that category, because I couldn't watch telly at night until about 1990 because I was at boarding school. Yeah, well played, Paul. You're the winner. Do you want to do the other hook and tease? Who do you think got photographed this weekend with election literature in which they'd managed to misspell their own name? Was it A, Jonathan C. Gullis? Was it B, Brendan Clark Hyphen? Or was it C, 30p Lee Anderson?
Well, I'm guessing his name's 30p because he spent 30p on proofreading his leaflets.
He's doing comedy as well now. You're absolutely right. And that is it from us for another day. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can, of course, also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
Thank you, James.
James O'Brien on LBC.